there is a silence that sits at the very centre of the human experience, a strange hollow ache that suggests we have forgotten something vital about who we are. We look up at the stars with a longing that feels less like curiosity and more like homesickness, yet we dig into the earth with a compulsion we cannot fully explain. History, as it has been written for us, is a comfort, a linear path from primitive darkness to the light of reason. But what if the map we have been given is incomplete? What if the earliest chapters were not lost to time, but deliberately torn out? Before we descend into the shadows of the garden to confront the possibility that our genesis was not a divine miracle, but a desperate industrial necessity, I invite you to settle in and clear your mind. If you find a value in this journey into the unknown, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but do so only if you truly resonate with the work we are doing here. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it in your reality? Welcome to Historic Sleep. Let us close our eyes and open the forbidden archives. If you stare long enough at the timeline of life on Earth, you begin to notice a rhythm, a cadence that is almost musical in its predictability. It is a slow, grinding beat, measured not in centuries or millennia, but in eons. Evolution, as we have been taught to understand it, is a conservative artist. It does not make sudden, frantic leaps. It makes minute adjustments, shaving a millimetre off a beak here, thickening a patch of fur there, responding to the pressures of the environment with the agonising patience of a glacier carving a valley. For millions of years, this rhythm held true. The great lizards ruled for an eternity, changing little. The ancestors of the sharks swam in primordial oceans with the same lethal efficiency they possess today. Perfect machines that required no updates. And for a very long time, the hominids, the ancestors we claim as our own, followed this same drowsy tempo. Homo erectus, a creature of impressive resilience, walked this planet for nearly 2 million years. 2 million years of stone tools that barely changed. 2 million years of fire and foraging, existing in a state of equilibrium with the natural world. They were part of the ecosystem, animals among animals, surviving, reproducing, and dying without leaving a scar upon the geology of the planet. And then something happened, something impossible. In the blink of a geological eye, the rhythm broke. The slow, steady drumbeat of natural selection was interrupted by a violent, discordant screech, a sudden acceleration that defies the logic of biology. Out of the silence of the Rift Valley, a new creature emerged, not through the gradual accretion of traits, but with the suddenness of a thunderclap. We appeared, Homo sapiens. We arrived with a brain that had exploded in size, tripling in volume in a time frame that, by Darwinian standards, is instantaneous. We appeared with a fragility that makes no survival sense. Skin easily burned by the sun, jaws too small for our teeth, backs that ache under the weight of upright posture, and infants born in a state of helpless prematurity because our skulls had become too large to pass through the pelvic canal of a fully gestational pregnancy. Consider the strangeness of this. In the brutal economy of nature, energy is the only currency that matters. A brain is an expensive organ. It is a furnace that consumes 20% of the body's metabolic energy, while accounting for only 2% of its weight. For a species living on the edge of starvation, foraging in the savannas, evolving such a massive, energy-draining organ is a suicide note. It is a biological extravagance that should have been weeded out by natural selection. Yet, not only did we keep this burdensome intellect, but it also brought with it a host of maladaptations that should have killed us. We lost our fur, the natural insulation and protection of every other primate. We lost the muscle density of our cousins. A chimpanzee, pound for pound, is 5 times stronger than a human male. We became soft, naked, and physically incompetent, relying entirely on this sudden, overgrown neurological anomaly to survive. We are told this was an accident of nature, a fortuitous mutation that allowed us to outthink the lion and the wolf. But look closer at the software running on this new hardware. With this exploded brain came a sense of separation that no other animal possesses. We do not fit in. We are the only creature that alters its environment to suit itself rather than adapting to the environment. We clothe ourselves because we are not suited for the climate. We cook our food because our digestive tracts can no longer process raw intake efficiently. We are plagued by psychological neuroticism, a sense of anxiety, and temporal awareness that seems disconnected from the immediate needs of survival. We look at the stars and feel a pull, a nostalgia for a place we have never been, while the rest of the animal kingdom looks down at the earth, content in their belonging. There is a gap in the fossil record, a missing link that has haunted paleoanthropology since its inception. We are constantly shown charts of skulls, arranged in a neat line from the primitive ape to the modern human, implying a smooth transition. But the charts are a lie, the lines are dotted, the transitions are inferred, not proven. There is a moment where the creature was an animal, and then abruptly it was something else, something that possessed the capacity for abstract syntax, complex mathematics, and the contemplation of its own mortality. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection alongside Darwin, was deeply troubled by this. He looked at the human mind, the capacity for high art, for symphonies, for complex geometry, and he realised that these traits offered no survival advantage to a hunter-gatherer on the plains of Africa. Why would a cave dweller need a brain capable of calculating the circumference of the planet? Nature does not over-engineer. It does not give a gazelle wings it cannot use. Yet we possess a mental capacity that far exceeds the requirements of our primitive survival. This suggests that the human brain was not a product of slow, upward drift, but of a specific, targeted event. It suggests an intervention. If we view the human body not as a cathedral of evolution, but as a crime scene, the clues begin to align. We bear the marks of a species that was domesticated. Just as we took the wolf and bred it into the docile dog, shrinking its snout and retaining its juvenile traits to make it serve us, someone, or something, seems to have done the same to us. We exhibit the classic signs of domestication: the reduction in jaw size, the crowding of teeth, the fragility of the skeleton, and the retention of neoteny, or juvenile characteristics, into adulthood. We are the puppies of the primate world, stuck in a permanent state of development, malleable, teachable, and dependent. But who was the breeder? And for what purpose were we bred? The scientific community speaks of bottlenecks and mutations, trying to wrap the chaos of our genesis in the comforting blanket of random chance. They tell us that roughly 200,000 years ago, mitochondrial Eve emerged, the mother of us all. But they do not explain why she emerged then, or why the genetic code of humanity shows signs of what looks like artificial fusing. We have 46 chromosomes. Our closest relatives, the great apes, have 48. Somewhere in the dark mist of prehistory, 2 primal chromosomes were fused together to create human chromosome 2. This fusion is clean, precise, and it is the defining switch that turned the animal into the man. While nature can fuse chromosomes, the specific architecture of this fusion, combined with the sudden explosion of cranial capacity, feels less like a biological lottery win and more like a software patch. A modification. We must allow ourselves to think the unthinkable, that we are not the pinnacle of earthly evolution, but a deviation from it. We are a hybrid. There is a part of us that is terrestrial, born of the mud and the clay, linking us to the chimp and the mouse. But there is another part, the spark, the sudden expansion of consciousness, that feels alien to this sphere. It is as if a foreign operating system was forcibly installed onto a primitive hard drive, causing the system to overheat, to glitch, to function with brilliance, but also with profound instability. We are a species in conflict with itself, torn between the animal instincts of our lower brain and the cold calculating logic of our neocortex. This internal war is the hallmark of our existence. We destroy the ecosystem that sustains us, something no other organism does. We accumulate resources we do not need. We organise ourselves into hierarchies of servitude that mirror no natural pack structure, but resemble instead a labour force. If you strip away the romance of civilization, the cities and the symphonies, and look at the bare biological facts, we look less like the children of Gaia and more like a resource extracted from the local fauna, modified for a specific task and left running on a loop. The anomaly of the human brain is not a gift of the gods in the spiritual sense. It is a tool, and tools are designed by users. The silence of the fossil record, around 200,000 years ago, is not an empty space. It is a redacted file. It is the period where the upgrade occurred. And to understand the nature of this upgrade and the terrible purpose behind it, we cannot look solely at the bones. The bones only tell us that it happened. To understand why, we must leave the silence of the prehistoric African savanna and turn our eyes toward the first place where this new, strange creature began to organise, to build, and to write down its own history. We must look to the dust of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the black-headed people suddenly emerged from the darkness of the Stone Age with a fully formed civilization, and a very specific story about where they came from. They did not speak of evolution. They did not speak of random mutation. They spoke of the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth. And they were very clear about one thing. They were not here to help us. They were here to put us to work. If the sudden expansion of the human brain is the biological smoking gun of our history, then the sudden eruption of the Sumerian civilization is the ballistic trajectory that points back to the shooter. We are taught that the road to civilization is a long, arduous ascent. We imagine our ancestors slowly learning to stack stones, gradually figuring out how to irrigate a field, stumbling upon the wheel after centuries of dragging sledges through the mud. We expect a curve of progress that is gentle, incremental, and logical. But when we turn our gaze to the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, roughly 6,000 years ago, we do not see a curve. We see a vertical line. We see a cliff face of progress that appears almost overnight, defying every model of socio-political evolution we have managed to construct. In the dust of what is now southern Iraq, civilization did not crawl. It exploded. One moment, there are scattered, primitive hamlets, subsistence farmers living in mud huts, scratching a living from the earth with tools that had barely improved in millennia. The next moment, historically speaking, there is Sumer. And Sumer is not a village. It is a fully realised, complex, high-functioning society that seems to have materialised out of the ether with the completeness of a prefabricated city dropped from the sky. In a flash, the human species is suddenly operating with high-rise architecture, sophisticated plumbing and sewage systems, a bicameral Congress, a complex legal code, pharmaceutical recipes, schools, and a fully functional writing system. They had the wheel, they had the kiln, they had the sailboat, they had the plough. They possessed a knowledge of metallurgy that allowed them to create alloys which we would struggle to replicate without modern chemistry. This is the Sumerian singularity. It is a historical impossibility. Societies do not simply wake up one morning with a complete understanding of municipal planning and contract law. Yet the Sumerians did, and perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this singularity is not the technology itself, but the mathematics that underpinned it. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, a base 60 numbering system, that is in many ways superior to the base 10 metric system we use today. It is from them that we divide our circles into 360 degrees, our hours into 60 minutes, and our minutes into 60 seconds. We are still telling time using the watch that Sumer built. Their mathematics were not the crude scratchings of a developing culture. They were advanced, precise, and capable of calculating astronomical movements with a terrifying accuracy. Consider the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow, wobbling cycle of the Earth's axis, a celestial rhythm that takes 25,120 years to complete one full rotation. To notice this cycle, let alone calculate it, requires centuries of continuous astronomical observation and data logging. It requires a civilization to exist longer than the history of recorded time itself to verify the pattern. Yet the Sumerians knew it. They referred to it. They built their calendar and their ages, the age of the bull, the age of the ram, around this massive celestial mechanic. How? How does a civilization that has just emerged from the Stone Age possess knowledge that requires 25,000 years of observation? It's like finding a calculus textbook in the backpack of a kindergartner. The capability does not match the developmental timeline. Here lies the great hypocrisy of modern academia. We stand in awe of the Sumerian achievements. We happily accept their invention of the wheel, their division of time, their invention of writing, and their architectural innovations. We cite their records for legal precedents and economic history. We treat them as the undisputed cradle of civilization. But the moment we ask the Sumerians how they did it, the moment we read the clear, unambiguous explanations they left on thousands of clay tablets, we stop listening. We pat them on the head and call it myth. We relegate their history to the realm of fantasy. The Sumerians were not a boastful people. They did not claim to be geniuses. They did not claim to have invented these technologies through trial and error or human ingenuity. In fact, they were incredibly humble about their origins. They stated repeatedly and with great consistency that everything they knew, every law, every architectural technique, every grain of astronomical data, was a gift. They claimed that civilization was not developed. It was lowered from heaven. They described a transfer of knowledge, the me, a set of divine decrees or data chips of civilization handed to them by their gods. They described these gods not as ethereal spirits or abstract concepts of nature, but as physical, living beings, beings who walked among them, who ate, who drank, who held court, and who taught. Why do we trust the Sumerian accountant when he tallies bushels of barley, but dismiss him when he records the lineage of the kings? Why do we accept their geometry, but reject their genealogy? It is a selective blindness born of fear. Because if we accept the Sumerian text as historical records, rather than religious metaphors, we are forced to confront the reality of the gods. In the Sumerian pantheon, the Anunnaki, literally those who came from heaven to earth, were not magical. They were technologically superior. They were biological. They were teachers, yes, but they were also masters. The disconnect is profound. We look at the cylinder seals left behind by this culture, and we see depictions of the solar system that include all the planets we know today, including Pluto, which we only discovered in 1930. They depict the planets in the correct relative sizes. They place the sun at the centre, thousands of years before Copernicus risked his life to suggest such a thing. How can we look at a diagram of the solar system drawn on clay 6,000 years ago, acknowledge that it is accurate, and then claim that the text accompanying it, which says, "The Anunnaki taught us this," is a lie? It is an act of intellectual cowardice. We are staring at a civilization that had no infancy. It had no dark age of stumbling in the dark. It arrived fully formed. This suggests that the blueprint for our society was imported. It implies that the institutions we hold dear today, our courts, our schools, our marriage contracts, our money, are not the natural flowering of the human spirit, but the imposed systems of a higher management. The Sumerians were not the inventors. They were the implementers. They were the first franchise of a galactic corporation, set up in the mud of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to run a specific operation. And if civilization was a gift, we must ask, what was the price? Gifts from powerful entities are rarely free. The sudden uplift of humanity from the hunter-gatherer state to the urban dweller was not a benevolent act of charity. It was an infrastructure project, You do not build a city for the sake of the ants living in the cracks. You build it because you need a workforce that is centralized, organized, and capable of following complex instructions. The Sumerian singularity was not the dawn of human greatness. It was the breaking of the wild horse. It was the moment we were saddled, bridled, and put to work. The gods brought order, yes, but they also brought hierarchy. They brought taxation. They brought the concept of kingship, which was simply the appointment of a middle manager to oversee the human flock on behalf of the absentee owners. To understand the nature of this ownership, and to strip away the mythological veneer we have painted over these ancient truths, we must go deeper into the library of clay. We must look at the specific texts that describe the arrival. We must read the creation epics not as poetry, but as technical manuals. The Enuma Elish, the Epic of Atrahasis. These are not fairy tales. They are the minutes of the meetings where our fate was decided. They tell a story of politics, of rivalry, and of a desperate need for resources. The gods did not come here to be worshipped. They came here because they were dying, and the civilization they gifted us was merely the tool they needed to save themselves. To understand the true nature of our origins, we must be willing to commit a kind of intellectual heresy. We must be willing to look at the most sacred text in the Western world, the Book of Genesis, and recognise it not as an original document, but as a Reader's Digest version of a much older, much more detailed, and much more disturbing library. For centuries we have treated the Bible as the primary source, the Word of God, emerging from the vacuum of prehistory. But when the sands of the Middle East were brushed away in the 19th century to reveal the library of Ashurbanipal, in Nineveh, thousands of clay tablets shattered that illusion. We found the Enuma Elish, the 7 tablets of creation, and the Epic of Atrahasis. And as the cuneiform was deciphered, a shocking realization took hold. The biblical stories of creation, the garden and the flood, were not original revelations given to Moses. They were edited summaries of Sumerian records that were already thousands of years old. But in the editing process, something vital was lost. Or perhaps something vital was hidden. The Hebrew scribes writing during the Babylonian exile had a specific theological agenda: monotheism. They needed to unify their people under one God, so they took the complex, political, and often bureaucratic accounts of the Sumerian pantheon, a council of distinct entities with different names, personalities and agendas, and compressed them into a single, all-powerful character, Yahweh. This compression created a schizophrenia in the character of God that has confused theologians for 2,000 years. In one chapter, God is loving and creates man. In the next, he is angry and regrets the creation. In one verse, he warns Noah to save life. In the next, he sends the flood to destroy it. We are told this is the mystery of the divine. But when you read the original Sumerian tablets, the mystery vanishes. It was never one God with mood swings. It was 2 brothers, 2 leaders of a powerful expeditionary force, engaged in a bitter political rivalry. Enlil, the commander who viewed humanity as a nuisance, and Enki, the scientist who viewed us as his children. The Bible fused them into one, obscuring the truth of the conflict that defined our Genesis. The most profound evidence of this obfuscation lies in the word itself. In the Hebrew Bible, the word used for God in the creation narrative is Elohim. Any linguist will tell you that the suffix im in Hebrew indicates a plural masculine noun. Elohim does not mean God. It translates literally to the powerful ones or the rulers. This is why in Genesis 1:26 the text slips and reveals its source code. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." For centuries the church has tried to explain this away as the royal we, or a foreshadowing of the Trinity. But the Sumerian texts offer a simpler, more terrifying explanation. The us was real. It was an assembly. It was a corporate decision made by a council of the Anunnaki. The term Anunnaki is the key that unlocks the door. In standard mythology, we are taught to view them as sky gods, ethereal spirits representing thunder or water. But the etymology of the word is chillingly precise and means heaven or space. Ki means earth. Anunnaki translates literally to those who from heaven to earth came. It is not a title of divinity, it is a description of a travel itinerary. It defines them not by their holiness but by their trajectory. They were visitors. They were entities that physically descended from the upper atmosphere to the surface of this planet. When we read the Epic of Atrahasis, we find the gods depicted with a shocking lack of mysticism. They are not floating in clouds of glory, they are working. The text describes a time when the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil. This is a crucial distinction. Spirits do not suffer toil. Omnipotent beings do not get tired. But the Anunnaki did. The tablets describe them digging canals, clearing channels, and grumbling about the harshness of the labour. They complain about the heat. They complain about the food. These are biological entities subject to the laws of physics and biology. They required sustenance, shelter, and rest. They were not supernatural. They were superhuman only in their technology and longevity. This perspective shifts the narrative from religion to history, and specifically to the history of a colonization effort. If we reread the ancient texts through this lens, the glory of the Lord described by prophets like Ezekiel ceases to be a spiritual light and becomes something far more tangible. The Hebrew word often translated as glory is kavod, but the root of kavod implies weight, heaviness, something massive and imposing. When the kavod of the Lord settles on Mount Sinai, the mountain shakes. There is smoke and fire, and the sound of a trumpet that grows louder and louder. The people are warned to stay back, not because of spiritual impurity, but because if they touch the mountain, they will die. This reads less like a holy apparition and more like the radiation and exhaust warnings of a landing zone. The mistranslation extends to the most famous story of human ambition, the Tower of Babel. We are told the people wanted to build a tower to reach heaven, to make a name for themselves, and God struck them down for their pride. But the word translated as name is the Hebrew Shem. While Shem can mean name reputation, its Sumerian antecedent is Mu, which refers to an object, specifically a sky chamber or a vertical monument. The people of Babel were not building a statue to their own vanity. They were attempting to build a launch tower. Let us build us a city and a tower, and let us make a Shem, a rocket, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. They were trying to secure a physical link to the gods, perhaps to join them, or to prevent being abandoned. The reaction of the Lord, the Anunnaki leadership, was swift not because of offended vanity, but because of security. The primitive workers were gaining access to aviation technology. The language codes were scrambled, the project was dismantled, and the species was dispersed. It was a security containment protocol. The tablets of destiny, a recurring object of power in Mesopotamian myth, were not magical stones. They were devices. Possession of the tablets conferred the legal and functional authority to command the mission. When a god stole the tablets, the other gods were paralyzed, their systems offline. This sounds remarkably like a control key, a mainframe access code, or a flight computer. We are looking at a society run by technology that was so advanced it appeared as magic to the primitive humans watching from the reeds. But to the Anunnaki, it was standard operating procedure. By stripping away the God label and replacing it with those who came, the entire picture of our past resolves into focus. We are not the lonely creation of a solitary, invisible deity who tests us for moral worth. We are the subjects of a hierarchy of biological beings who came here with a purpose. The Enuma Elish details the solar system not as a mythic battle of dragons, but as a celestial map, describing the formation of the planets and the arrival of a foreign body into our system. It provides the context for the arrival. If the Anunnaki came from heaven, and if heaven is a physical place, then where is it? They did not materialize from another dimension. They crossed the void of space. The Sumerian astronomers were obsessed with the planets. They tracked them with obsessive precision, but they counted one more planet than we do. They spoke of a 12th member of the solar system, counting the sun and moon. They called it the planet of the crossing. They called it Nibiru. And it was from this wandering world, this ship of state acting as a planet, that the gods descended. The mistranslations of the Bible have kept us looking for heaven in the spiritual realm, blinding us to the reality that heaven was a specific location within our own solar system, a place with its own atmosphere, its own problems, and its own desperate need for the one substance that Earth possessed in abundance. The gods were not here on vacation. They were here on a salvage mission. To comprehend the sheer scale of the desperation that brought the visitors to our world, we must first understand the world they left behind. In the astronomical texts of the Sumerians, the planet Nibiru is described not merely as another rock in the void, but as the planet of the crossing. This title is not poetic, it is orbital. Unlike Earth, which traces a comfortable, nearly circular path around the warmth of the sun, Nibiru is a traveller of the deep dark. Its orbit is a vast, elongated ellipse, stretching far out beyond the realm of Pluto, into the freezing silence of the cometary halo, before swinging back inward to graze the heat of the inner solar system. The Sumerians called one complete circuit of this orbit a shar, a period roughly equivalent to 3,600 Earth years. This number was the foundation of their mathematics and their concept of the divine cycle. But for the inhabitants of Nibiru, the shar was not just a number. It was a pendulum of survival, swinging between fire and ice. Imagine a world that spends the vast majority of its existence in the interstellar, deep freeze. For such a planet to sustain life, specifically advanced biological life, it cannot rely solely on the distant, dim flicker of the sun. It must generate and retain its own heat. It requires a planetary blanket, a thick, robust atmosphere capable of trapping the internal geothermal energy of the planet and distributing it evenly, creating a greenhouse effect powerful enough to ward off the absolute zero of space. For eons, nature provided this. Nibiru was a volcanic world, its tectonic engine churning out clouds of ash and steam that wrapped the planet in a protective cocoon. Life flourished in this warm, dim twilight. They built their cities, they developed their sciences, and they mastered the stars. But planets, like living things, age. The internal fires of Nibiru began to cool. The volcanic vents that had spewed the life-saving gases into the upper atmosphere began to sputter and fall silent. The blanket began to thin. This is the universal nightmare of any planetary civilization: atmospheric attenuation. As the shield weakened, the heat began to bleed out into the vacuum. The long winters at the aphelion, the furthest point from the sun, became colder, longer, and more deadly. Vegetation withered. The pleasant twilight turned into a harsh, freezing night. The civilization of the Anunnaki faced an existential crisis that mirrors the fears of our own modern age. But in reverse, they were not fighting global warming, but global cooling. They were a species watching their sky slowly tear open, exposing them to the lethal indifference of the void. The scientists of Nibiru, the wise men of the council, scrambled for a solution. They could not reignite the core of their planet. They could not move the planet closer to the sun. They had to repair the shield. They needed a substance that could be suspended in the upper atmosphere, something that could reflect the escaping infrared heat back down onto the surface, while deflecting the harsh cosmic radiation that bombarded them during their close pass to the sun. This substance had to be chemically inert, so it would not react with other gases and degrade. It had to be non-corrosive. It had to be malleable enough to be reduced to the atomic level without losing its properties. and it had to be abundant enough to coat a world. There's only one element in the periodic table that fits this profile perfectly: gold. Here, we must unlearn everything we think we know about this metal. On Earth, we worship gold for its vanity. We make rings, crowns, and coins. We lock it in vaults as a hedge against inflation. We see it as a symbol of wealth. But to a civilization capable of space travel, gold is not money. Gold is a utility. It is an industrial imperative. Gold is virtually indestructible. It does not rust, tarnish, or corrode. It is an unparalleled conductor of electricity and a perfect reflector of infrared energy. This is why, even today, NASA coats the visors of astronauts and the instruments of satellites with a thin layer of gold. It is the only thing that works. The Anunnaki realized that if they could pulverize gold into fine, monoatomic particles, a white powder consisting of single atoms rather than clusters, and disperse it into their stratosphere, they could create a suspended shield, a golden mirror in the sky. But Nibiru was old. Its resources were depleted. The gold they had possessed was gone, mined out eons ago or buried too deep to reach. They were a dying people with a theoretical cure, but no medicine. They needed a new source, and so they turned their sensors outward, scanning the solar system as their planet swung on its long, lonely arc. They looked at the hammered bracelet, the asteroid belt, where the debris of a primordial celestial collision floated. They found traces there, but extraction in zero gravity from moving rocks is inefficient and dangerous. They looked further inward, and there, glistening in the Goldilocks zone, third from the sun, was a planet that was essentially a heavy metal miracle: Earth. In the Sumerian cosmology, specifically the Enuma Elish, the formation of Earth is described as the result of a celestial collision between a moon of Nibiru and a primordial watery planet called Tiamat. This collision cracked Tiamat in half, pushing one half to a new orbit to become Earth and scattering the other half to form the asteroid belt. This violent birth is crucial because it explains the geological accessibility of Earth's gold. The veins were not just buried in the core. The trauma of the planet's formation had forced molten gold into the cracks and fissures of the crust, bringing it tantalizingly close to the surface. Earth was rich, it was wet, and most importantly, it was loaded with the specific heavy element required to save the atmosphere of Nibiru. This reframes the entire narrative of the invasion. The Anunnaki did not come to Earth as conquerors seeking slaves, at least not initially. They did not come to spread their religion or to explore the cosmos for the sake of curiosity. They came as environmental refugees. They came as a work crew. The motivation was not greed, it was survival. The gold was their oxygen tank. Every ounce they extracted was another day of life for their families back home. This explains the singular, obsessive focus of the ancient world on this one metal. Why did the gods demand gold? Why were the temples lined with it? Why do we, their creations, still feel a hypnotic pull toward it? It is because the entire reason for our existence on this planet revolves around the extraction of this material. We were not created to prey. We were created to dig. The mission was authorized. The Council of Nibiru, led by the celestial father figure Anu, dispatched an expeditionary force. This was a massive undertaking, a journey of immense risk. They had to calculate the precise moment when Nibiru's orbit brought it close enough to the inner solar system to launch a shuttle, yet not so close as to cause gravitational catastrophe. They had to cross the chaotic debris field of the asteroid belt. They had to survive the radiation belts of the sun, and they had to land on a wild, untamed planet, teeming with giant megafauna and unpredictable weather. Leading this mission were two brothers, half-siblings, rivals for the throne, and polar opposites in temperament. Enlil, the strict disciplinarian, the commander of the skies who viewed the mission as a military operation, and Enki, the scientist, the master of waters and engineering, who understood the geology and the chemistry required to extract the prize. They did not come alone. They brought with them a corps of astronauts, the Igigi, the Watchers, who were destined to do the heavy lifting. They were the lower-class gods, the grunt workers of the expedition. As the ships descended through the thick, oxygen-rich atmosphere of Earth, splashing down in the waters of the Persian Gulf, they were not greeted by kings or armies. There was no one here to greet them but the roaming bands of Homo erectus, primitive, hairy, and mute. The Anunnaki looked at this lush green world not with wonder, but with the pragmatic eyes of miners looking at a quarry. They set up their base at the edge of the marshes. They called it Eridu, literally, home in the faraway. It was the first outpost, the first colony. And the silence of the prehistoric world was about to be broken by the sound of machinery. The great extraction had begun, and with it, the clock began to tick toward the moment when the labour would become too much for the gods to bear, forcing them to create a substitute. Imagine the silence of the Persian Gulf 445,000 years ago. It is not the busy, oil-slicked shipping lane of the modern geopolitical map. It is a pristine, primordial wetland, a vast expanse of emerald marshes and slow-moving waters, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spill their silt into the sea. The air is thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of unpolluted mud and blooming vegetation. The only sounds are the rustle of the wind in the tall reeds, the cry of waterfowls, and the splash of fish breaking the surface. There are no engines, there are no cities, there is no history, only the endless cyclical present of the natural world. And then the sky tears open. The first arrival was likely not a majestic descent of a glowing temple, but a controlled crash, a violent displacement of water and steam, as a craft of immense tonnage pierced the atmosphere and settled into the shallows. When the hatch opened, the air that rushed in was not the thin, struggling atmosphere of a dying Nibiru, but the rich, intoxicating oxygen of a vibrant earth. For the crew stepping out onto the wing of that craft, this was not paradise. It was a hostile, heavy, overwhelming frontier. They called the place Eridu. In their language, the syllables carried a specific, poignant weight, Eridu, meaning home in the faraway. It is a name that vibrates with the longing of the exile. It is the linguistic route that would eventually travel through time and tongues, mutating into the Germanic Erde, the English Earth, the Aramaic Eretz. The very name of our planet is a fossilized memory of that first outpost, a label stamped onto the map by visitors who viewed this world not as their origin, but as their destination. Eridu was not built of stone and mortar, at least not initially. It was a functional encampment, a forward operating base established on the edge of the water because the water was the primary objective. The plan conceived by the scientific mind of Enki was elegant in its theoretical simplicity. If the gold of Earth had been churned up from the depths and scattered by the primordial collision, then the ocean should be rich with it. The water itself held the particles in suspension. There would be no need for the brutalizing labour of crushing rock. They would simply process the sea. Picture the scene, stripping away the religious iconography of later millennia. We are not looking at gods in silk robes sitting on clouds. We are looking at engineers in protective suits, setting up massive filtration units in the swamps. We are looking at the Igigi, the astronauts, the corps of workers, wading through the muck, fighting off the biting insects, struggling to adapt to the gravity of a planet that is larger and denser than their own. The physical toll must have been immediate. On Nibiru, with its dying atmosphere and greater distance from the sun, the light would have been dimmer, the gravity perhaps different, the circadian rhythms longer. Here the sun is a blinding, unshielded fusion reactor burning directly overhead. The days are short, the nights are dark. The biological clocks of the visitors were out of sync. This was not a realm of magic. It was a realm of sweat. Enki, the leader of this first expedition, is the central figure of this phase. He is the archetype of the scientist hero, the Lord of Earth. Enki, but more accurately, the Lord of the Depths. He established his headquarters in the Abzu, a term often translated as the abyss or the deep water, but which functionally referred to the wet, mineral-rich zones where the extraction took place. He was the master of the technology, the one who understood the hydrology of the delta. Under his command, the machines began to hum. The silence of the marshes was replaced by the rhythmic thrumming of pumps and separators. Day after day, night after night, they processed the waters of the Gulf, filtering out the precious suspended gold, chemically precipitating it, and packing it into transport vessels to be shuttled back to the orbiting mothership, and from there to the home planet. But reality has a way of destroying theoretical models. The concentration of gold in the water, while present, was too low. The yield was insufficient. For every 1,000 gallons of water processed, the return was microscopic. Back on Nibiru, the shield was still failing. The breaches in the atmosphere were widening. The reports coming down from the council were becoming frantic. Faster, they demanded. More. But the physics of the operation had hit a wall. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone, and you cannot filter a planetary shield from a bay. Not at the speed required to save a dying civilization. The mission was failing. The easy way had proven to be a dead end. This moment of failure is the pivot point of our prehistory. If the water extraction had worked, the Anunnaki might have packed up their filters after a few showers, declared the mission a success, and left Earth to return to its wild slumber. We would not be here. Homo erectus would have continued to chip stones in the valley, evolving at his own slow pace. But the failure necessitated a change in strategy. Enki, ever the geologist, knew that the gold in the water was merely the runoff from a greater source. The veins lay deep underground, specifically in the Abzu, not just the water but the lower world, the mineral-rich, jagged spine of southeast Africa. To get the gold in the quantities they needed, they would have to stop skimming the surface and start tearing into the crust. They would have to mine. This decision fundamentally changed the nature of the expedition. Mining is not filtration. Mining is war against the earth. It requires shafts. It requires explosives. It requires crushing, smelting, and refining. And most importantly, it requires a massive amount of physical labour. The Igigi, who had signed up for a mission of exploration and technical maintenance, were suddenly handed pickaxes and laser cutters, and told to descend into the black, suffocating heat of the subterranean tunnels. The gods became shift workers. The romantic vision of the star travellers dissolved into the grime of the quarry. Enlil, the commander, arrived to oversee this expansion. If Enki was the sympathetic scientist, Enlil was the hardened general, the administrator sent to ensure quotas were met. The friction between the two brothers began to spark here, in the mud of Eridu and the mines of the Abzu. Enlil viewed the earth as a resource depot. Enki viewed it with a growing curiosity, and perhaps a touch of affection for its biological diversity. But the mission profile was clear. Gold, at any cost. So the infrastructure grew. Eridu expanded from a base camp into a logistical hub. Other settlements were established. Bad Tabira, the processing centre. Larak, the control centre. Sipar, the spaceport. This was the establishment of the Sumerian Edin. Not a garden of flowers, but the Edin, the home of the righteous ones, which in the technical language of the tablets meant the enclosure of the administrators. It was a colony built on the back of distinct class warfare. There were the leaders, the Anunnaki elite, who directed the operations from the cool, climate-controlled sanctuaries of the ziggurats. And there were the Igigi, the working-class gods, who toiled in the mines of Africa and the mud of Mesopotamia. For 40 shahs, 144,000 years, this continued. Can you imagine the sheer scale of that monotony? Generations of workers, though their lifespans were long, grinding away at the rock face, The novelty of the new planet had long since worn off. The heat was oppressive. The work was backbreaking. The psychological strain of being trapped on a foreign rock, serving a distant home that was slowly freezing, began to curdle into resentment. The gods were tired. Their bodies, though superior to ours, were aching. The dust of the mines clogged their lungs. The vibration of the drills rattled their bones. They looked at the lush surface world where Enlil lived in comfort, and they looked at their own blackened hands, and the seeds of the first revolution in history were sown. It was not a rebellion of man against God. Man did not exist yet. It was a rebellion of God against God. The silence of the marshes had been broken by machines, but soon it would be broken by the shouts of mutiny. The Anunnaki were about to learn that even among the stars, the laws of labour relations apply. If you push the worker too hard, eventually he will put down his tool and pick up a weapon. And it is in the fires of this labour dispute that the blueprint for humanity would be drawn. We were not conceived in love. We were conceived as a strike breaker. There is a breaking point built into the psychology of every sentient being, a structural limit where the capacity for endurance snaps under the weight of accumulated suffering. We often imagine the gods of antiquity as beings of infinite patience, dwelling in a state of timeless serenity. But the texts of the Atrahasis epic paint a starkly different picture. They describe a workforce pushed to the edge of madness. For 40 shars, a period of time that equates to 144,000 Earth years, the Igigi had borne the yoke of the mission. Try to conceptualize that duration. It is longer than the entire history of modern civilization. It is an eternity of grinding rock, of breathing subterranean dust, of sweating in the deep veins of the Abzu while the sun remained a distant rumour. The novelty of the expedition had evaporated millennia ago, replaced by a crushing routine of extraction and quota. These were not mindless automatons. They were intelligent, emotional, biological entities who had left their families and their homeworld to save it, only to find themselves treated as expendable machinery in the darkness of a foreign planet. The tension in the mines of Southeast Africa was not a sudden flare-up. It was a slow, toxic accumulation of resentment. The Igigi looked at their hands, calloused and stained with the grime of the excavation, and then they looked toward the distant north, toward the Edin, where Enlil, the commander, lived in the house of the mountain. They knew that while they suffocated in the tunnels, the High Command was enjoying the cool breezes of the cedar forests, consuming the best food, and living in relative luxury. The disparity of class, the friction between the administrator and the labourer, is not a modern human invention. It is apparently a universal constant, and on one specific night, the constant failed. The discipline that had held the mission together for eons shattered. The rebellion began not with a shout, but with a symbolic act of destruction. The texts are incredibly specific about this moment. The Igigi did not just stop working. They turned on the tools of their oppression. They took their spades, their baskets, and their heavy machinery, and they set them on fire. Imagine the scene in the deep pits of the Abzu, the advanced technology of a spacefaring civilization, the laser drills and the excavators, piled into a heap and torched. The smoke billowed up through the shafts, a black signal of defiance rising against the stars. "Let us confront the Chamberlain," they cried. "Let him relieve us of our heavy work." It was a strike organised and militant. They declared war not on the mission, but on the management. The mob of astronaut miners, their faces smeared with the dust of the gold veins, began the march toward the headquarters. This was a terrifying prospect. These were not unarmed peasants. These were powerful beings, possessing the same genetic strength and perhaps the same weaponry as their overlords. They surrounded the sanctuary of Enlil in the middle of the night. The texts describe the scene with a palpable sense of dread. The house of the commander was encircled. The tools of mining had been replaced by weapons of war. The silence of the night was replaced by the chanting of the mob. Inside the sanctuary, the mood was one of panicked confusion. Enlil, the supreme commander of Earth, the entity whom later religions would fear as the Lord of Storms, was terrified. He bolted his doors, he summoned his vizier, Nusku, and demanded to know what was happening. Nusku, ever the diplomat, went out to speak to the crowd, but there was no reasoning with them. The Igigi were done. "Every one of us has declared war," they shouted. "The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard. The trouble is too much." These are the recorded words of the gods. They are not high-flown speeches about destiny or glory. They are the raw, exhausted complaints of workers who have been pushed too far. They were not asking for a pay raise. They were asking for their lives back. They were demanding to return to Nibiru, or at the very least to stop the endless digging. The situation escalated to a planetary crisis. Enlil, weeping, according to some translations, actually shedding tears of frustration and fear, contacted Anu, the king on Nibiru. He offered to resign. He offered to execute the ringleaders. He wanted to crush the rebellion with force. But Anu, watching from the throne of the homeworld, possessed a wisdom that his son lacked. He looked at the data, he looked at the blackened hands of the Igigi and the sheer impossibility of the task they had been given. And in a moment of supreme judgment, the king sided with the rebels. "Why do we blame them?" Anu asked. "Their work was heavy. Their distress was much. It was a validation of the strike, a celestial admission that the labour plan was flawed. But this validation created a terrifying vacuum. The gold was still needed. The shield on Nibiru was still thinning. The survival of the entire species depended on the flow of metal from Earth. If the Igigi would not dig, and the High Council could not force them, the mission was effectively over. The machinery would rust in the silence. The gold would remain in the rock. And the atmosphere of the home planet would eventually collapse, extinguishing their civilization. They stood at a precipice. They had the technology, they had the location, but they lacked the hands. It was into this tense, paralysed silence that Enki stepped forward. Enki the scientist, the one who had always felt a strange kinship with the rhythms of this wet blue planet. He had been experimenting in his laboratories in the Abzu. He had been studying the local fauna. He had been watching the bipedal creatures that roamed the edges of their settlements, the Homo erectus. He had seen their resilience, their strength, their ability to survive in the harsh environment without spacesuits or life support. They were primitive, yes, they were animals, but they were biologically compatible with the planet in a way the Anunnaki never would be. Enki raised his hand in the Council of the Gods and proposed a solution that was as brilliant as it was heretical. He did not suggest bringing more machines. He did not suggest bringing more astronauts. He suggested manufacturing a worker. "The creature you need already exists," he said, referring to the hominid. "We only need to bind upon it the image of the gods." The implication of this statement is staggering. Enki was proposing genetic engineering. He was proposing to take an existing evolutionary product, a wild animal, and splice it with the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves. He wanted to uplift a lower species, not for the sake of its own evolution, but to create a biological robot, a creature intelligent enough to take orders and use tools, but primitive enough to be controlled. A creature that could bear the yoke that the Igigi had cast off. The council was sceptical. To create life or to modify it to this degree was a crossing of ethical and perhaps cosmic lines. But desperation is the mother of all compromise. The Igigi were banging on the gates, torches in hand. The gold shipments had stopped. The sky of Nibiru was darkening. Enlil, who despised the noisy, smelly primates of Earth, looked at the rebellious army of his own people, and then he looked at Enki's proposal. He saw a way out. He saw a way to break the strike without losing the mission. He nodded. The decision was made. The House of Shimti, the House of Creation, was prepared. The womb goddesses were summoned. The rebellion of the Igigi had succeeded, but the cost of their freedom would be paid by a new life form. They were about to pass the pickaxe to us. The age of the gods' toil was ending, and the age of human servitude was about to begin. We were not dreamed up in a garden of delight. We were commissioned in a boardroom to settle a labour dispute. The mutiny of the Igigi did not liberate Earth. It merely changed the management of the mines. And now, the great experiment was ready to begin. The test tubes were ready. The clay was waiting. The solution to the labour crisis did not come from a divine decree or a wave of a magic wand. It came from a laboratory. With the strike of the Igigi bringing the operations of the entire mission to a grinding halt, the focus of the Anunnaki leadership shifted from the mines of the Abzu to a specific facility known in the ancient texts as the Bit Shimti. In the standard translations of the Akkadian and Sumerian tablets, this name is often rendered poetically as the House of Breath, or the house where the wind of life is blown in. It sounds ethereal, a place of spiritual quickening. But if we strip away the romance of the translation and look at the function described within its walls, a colder, more clinical reality emerges. The Bit Shimti was a bioengineering facility. It was a sterile environment designed for the manipulation of cellular matter. It was here, under the white-hot glare of necessity, that Enki, the chief scientist, and Ninhursag, the chief medical officer, met to solve the problem of the worker by rewriting the code of life itself. The task before them was monumental. They needed a creature that possessed the physical robustness of the local fauna, the Homo erectus that roamed the African savannas, but the intellectual capacity of the Anunnaki. The local hominids were perfectly adapted to the Earth's gravity, its solar radiation, and its atmosphere. They were strong, resilient, and immune to the diseases that might plague a visitor from the stars. However, they lacked the spark. Their brains were wired for survival, not for comprehension. They could not understand complex commands, handle mining lasers, or grasp the concept of a quota. The Anunnaki, on the other hand, possessed the intellect, but lacked the physical durability for the harsh labour. The solution was obvious but technically forbidden. A chimera, a hybrid, a creature that was of the earth, yet not entirely from it. The text described the process with a level of detail that is uncomfortable for those who wish to maintain a purely spiritual view of Genesis. Enki instructs Ninhursag to take the clay of the Abzu. For thousands of years, religious scholars have interpreted this clay as literal mud, painting a picture of God sculpting a statue like a potter. But the Sumerian word used is tiet. In the context of their medical text, this does not mean dirt. It refers to that which has life, or more specifically, malleable biological tissue. They were not making mud pies. They were harvesting cellular material. They were taking the ovum of the local hominid, the genetic base of the earthly creature, to serve as the chassis for the new model. But the chassis needed an engine. It needed the upgrade, and this is where the texts become dark and deeply specific. To grant the creature intelligence, to bind upon it the image of the gods, a donor was required. The Epic of Atrahasis states that a god named Te'ema, an entity possessing intelligence or personality, was selected. The text says this god was slaughtered, and his blood was mixed with the clay. Again, we must look past the ritualistic language of the Bronze Age scribe. Blood, in the ancient world, was the seat of the essence, the carrier of the life force. Today we call it DNA. The slaughter, or sacrifice, suggests the extraction of genetic material, perhaps a terminal procedure, or simply a donation of such magnitude that it was mythologized as a death. The mixing was the splicing of the alien genome into the terrestrial one. Consider the symbol of Enki, the mastermind of this operation. In ancient iconography, he is often depicted with two serpents entwined around a rod. This symbol, the caduceus, survives to this day as the emblem of the medical profession. We are told it represents balance or healing, but look at it with the eyes of a geneticist. Two strands spiralling around a central axis, connected by rungs. It is the double helix. It is the structure of DNA. The ancients were not drawing snakes for the sake of aesthetics. They were drawing the blueprint. Enki was the lord of the helix. He was the one who understood that to create the worker, he had to unzip the code of the wild hominid and insert the sequence of the Anunnaki. This was not an immaculate creation. It was a messy, trial and error scientific struggle. The texts do not shy away from the failures. They describe Enki and Ninhursag drinking, perhaps a reference to the use of intoxicants, or perhaps a metaphor for the hubris of their work, and producing beings that were flawed. They created a man who could not hold back his urine. They created a woman who could not bear children. They created beings with organs that failed, with limbs that did not function. These monsters of the mythic record were the prototypes. They were the failed experiments of a genetics lab rushing to meet a production deadline. It destroys the idea of divine perfection. A perfect God does not make mistakes. A scientist working on a new genome makes many. Finally, they achieved a stable zygote, but a zygote needs a womb. The Homo erectus female was too small, her biology too primitive to carry this new, large-brained hybrid to term. The rejection rate would be too high, so the Anunnaki women, the Ninti, birth goddesses, stepped forward to serve as the surrogate mothers. The fertilized embryos, the mixed clay, were implanted into the wombs of the goddesses. This is the House of Shimti in full operation, a row of birth chambers, monitored by Ninhursag, where the wives and daughters of the astronauts carried the children of the new race. It was a biological assembly line. The text described the counting of the months, the critical moment of the 10th month, since the Anunnaki cycle might have been different, or the hybrid pregnancy took longer, and the need for surgical intervention. Ninhursag is described as performing a C-section, opening the womb to deliver the prize. When the first viable specimen was pulled from the womb, Enki held it up. It was a male. In the Sumerian tongue, he was called the Adapa. In the later Hebrew condensation, he would be known as Adam. But Adam is not a proper name. It is a classification. It comes from Adama, meaning earth or soil, but linked to the dark red colour of the blood. He was the earthling. He looked at his creators with eyes that held a new kind of light. He had the smooth skin of the gods, lacking the full fur of his wild ancestors. He had the hands of a worker, capable of fine manipulation. And most importantly, he had the brain capacity to understand language, to follow orders, and to fear his masters. The breath of life that was blown into his nostrils was not a spiritual soul in the religious sense. In the context of a medical facility, it reads like a resuscitation procedure. The newborn hybrid, perhaps struggling to breathe in the shock of birth, was given oxygen, stimulated, and brought online. The machine started to run. The eyes dilated. The lungs expanded. The first human, or rather the first Homo sapiens, drew a breath of the atmosphere he was designed to mine. It is a chilling realization. We look for a divine spark, a reason for our existence that involves love or destiny or a higher cosmic plan. But the scene in the House of Shimti suggests that our genesis was functional. We were not created to be the children of God, we were created to be the relief shift. The Anunnaki did not want a partner, they wanted a tool that could hold a shovel and take an order. The image we bear, the emotional complexity, the capacity for love, the intellectual hunger, these were side effects of the genetic splice. They were the unavoidable consequences of using high-grade Anunnaki DNA to boost the processing power of the hominid. We got their hardware, and with it, we got their neuroses, their capacity for violence, and their longing for the stars. As Enki looked at the Adapa, he must have felt a conflict that would define the rest of our history. He had solved the labour problem. He had saved the mission. But he had also created a life that was conscious of its own existence. He had created a being that could look back at him and ask, why? The primitive worker was ready to be sent to the Edin. The nursery phase was over. The orientation was about to begin. And the first lesson the new worker would learn was that while he looked like the gods and thought like the gods, he was not one of them. He was property. When the first successful hybrid opened its eyes in the sterile light of the house of Shimti, the Anunnaki did not give it a name that signified majesty or dominion. They did not call it the Prince of the Earth or the Child of the Stars. In the cuneiform tablets, the designation given to this new being is Lulu Amelu. The sound of it is almost affectionate, like a lullaby, but the meaning is brutally descriptive. Lulu means the mixed one. It implies a mongrel, a creature of impure stock, a biological cocktail shaken together from two incompatible sources. It is a term that defines us not by who we are, but by what we are, a synthesis. We are the result of a collision between the high-frequency genetics of a spacefaring civilization and the low-frequency biology of a terrestrial primate. And that collision is not just a story written on clay, it is a war that is still being fought in the nucleus of every cell in your body. To understand the tragedy and the miracle of the Lulu, we must look at the human animal with the cold, objective eye of an engineer. If you were designing a creature for survival on the plains of Africa, you would never design a human. We are a catalogue of design flaws. Consider our skin. We are the only primate that has shed its fur, leaving us woefully exposed to the solar radiation that beats down on the very continent where we were born. We burn, we blister, we develop melanomas. A creature evolved by nature does not lose its primary protection against its environment unless it has an alternative. We have none, save for the clothes we must fashion. A behaviour that is unique to us because our biology is insufficient. Consider our backs. We suffer from chronic lumbar pain, slipped discs, and spinal misalignments because our skeleton was forcibly pivoted from a horizontal, quadrupedal suspension to a vertical, bipedal stack. It was done too quickly. The chaotic zigzag structure of the human spine is the architectural evidence of a renovation project that was rushed to meet a deadline. We are walking upright not because it is efficient, it requires massive energy to balance, but because our masters needed a worker whose hands were free to hold tools. But the most devastating evidence of our artificial construction lies in the trauma of our birth. In the entire animal kingdom, birth is a natural, manageable process. A gazelle drops its fawn, and within minutes the fawn is standing, running, integrating into the herd. The mother experiences discomfort, perhaps, but not the life-threatening agony that defines human labour. For the human female, birth is a medical crisis. The infant's head, bloated by the massive artificially expanded brain, is too large for the pelvic canal. The mother must risk death to bring the child into the world, and the child must be born prematurely in a state of absolute helplessness, effectively a fetus outside the womb, because if it stayed in utero any longer, it would kill the host. This is the curse of Eve mentioned in Genesis. I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. This was not a punishment for eating an apple. It was the biological price tag of the genetic upgrade. The Anunnaki widened the bandwidth of our intelligence, but they did not have time to re-engineer the chassis to support it. The biblical narrative, in its attempt to simplify this technical history, gives us the story of the rib. We are told that God put Adam into a deep sleep, took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh. Then, from that rib, he made the woman. For centuries this has been read as a poetic fairy tale. But if we return to the Sumerian source, the linguistic fog clears. The Sumerian word for rib is Ti, but Ti has a dual meaning. It means rib, yes, but it also means life, or life force. The goddess Ninti is the lady of the rib, but she is more accurately the lady of life. When the texts speak of taking the Ti from the Adapa, they are not talking about bone surgery. They are talking about extracting the essence of life the cellular material, the DNA, to create a counterpart. And what of the deep sleep? The Hebrew word used is tardema. In the Bible, this word is used only in very specific contexts, often involving a heavy, unnatural slumber imposed by the divine. When Abraham falls into a tardema, a horror of great darkness falls upon him. This is not a nap. This is anesthesia. The Lord God acting as a surgeon, sedating the subject to perform a tissue extraction without resistance. We are reading a medical report that has been retold by a tribe of desert nomads who had no vocabulary for sedation or biopsy, so they used the words they had, sleep and bone. The creature that emerged from this process, the Lulu, was a marvel of biotechnology, but it was also a slave. We must not romanticize the garden. The Lulu was not placed in the Edin to meditate or to write poetry. The texts are explicit. He created the Lulu to bear the yoke. The very definition of our existence was to relieve the Igigi of their burden. We were created to dig the ditches, to harvest the crops, to clear the channels, to mine the gold. We were given hands that could grip a shovel and a mind that could understand the command dig, but not a mind that would ask why, at least not initially. This explains the profound sense of inferiority that has plagued the human psyche since the beginning of recorded time. Why do we constantly seek a master? Why do we build statues of giant men and bow down to them? Why is the history of humanity a history of hierarchy and submission? It is because we remember. Deep in the limbic system, in the genetic memory of the species, we remember the tall ones. We remember the giants who walked among us, who gave us orders, who held the weapons that could kill with a beam of light. We remember that we were not the owners of this world. We were the staff. The God-shaped hole in the human heart is not a spiritual void. It is the empty space left by the departure of our supervisors. We are a domesticated species that has lost its master, wandering the house confused, waiting for a command that never comes. The Lulu was a hybrid, and like many hybrids in nature, the mule, the liger, it was initially sterile. This is a crucial detail often overlooked. The first batches of workers created in the Bit Shimti were biological dead ends. They could work, they could live, but they could not reproduce. This meant that every time a worker died or wore out, the Anunnaki had to go back to the lab, back to the birth goddesses, and manufacture a replacement. This was inefficient. It required the constant participation of the Anunnaki women, the birth goddesses, who eventually rebelled against being used as broodmares for a slave race. The cry of the goddesses, mentioned in the texts, mirrors the earlier cry of the mining Igigi. They were tired of the procedure. This crisis of production led to the next great modification, the second tier of engineering. The decision was made to grant the Lulu the ability to procreate on its own, to install the sexual reproductive drive and the biological machinery to sustain it. This is the true meaning of the knowledge in the garden. It was not knowledge of good and evil, it was knowledge of sexuality. Yada, to know in the Bible, is a sexual term. And Adam knew his wife. To give the worker the power to replicate was to give it a dangerous autonomy. It meant the population could grow without the direct control of the laboratory. It meant that tools could start making more tools. But before that dangerous upgrade, there was the Lulu in its raw state, a creature of immense potential and immense sadness. Imagine looking into a mirror for the first time and seeing a face that does not belong to the animal kingdom, yet is not quite divine. We had the eyes of the gods, but the mortality of the beast. We had the capacity to dream of the stars, but our feet were chained to the mud. We were the mixed ones, stranded between two worlds, belonging to neither. The Anunnaki looked at us with a mixture of pride and disgust. We were useful. We were ugly. We were necessary. The heavy baskets were taken from the shoulders of the astronauts and placed onto the backs of the humans. The dust of the mines began to settle into our lungs. The experiment was a success. The gold was flowing again. And in the high councils of the Anunnaki, the problem was considered solved. They did not realize that by creating a servant who could think, they had planted the seeds of their own obsolescence. They had not just built a worker, they had built a witness. There is a persistent, aching memory lodged deep in the collective unconscious of the human race. A memory of a time before the struggle, before the cities, before the wars. We call it the Golden Age. We call it paradise. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, it is the Garden of Eden, a lush, verdant sanctuary where the first man and woman walked in naked innocence, plucking fruit from heavy boughs, living in perfect harmony with their Creator. We are taught to view this place as a spiritual resort, a utopia designed solely for human happiness. But if we peel back the layers of theological paint and examine the structural reality of this garden, the image of the resort fades, and a very different architecture begins to emerge. It was not a park, it was a plantation. The word Eden itself is our first clue. We assume it is a Hebrew word meaning delight, and while later linguistic drifts adopted that connotation, its roots are much older and far more functional. In the Sumerian language, the language of the source code, the word is Edin. It translates as the steppe, the plain, or more specifically, the place of the righteous ones. It does not designate a magical realm. It designates a geographical zone. It refers to the flat, fertile delta between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where the Anunnaki established their primary surface operations. The garden within Eden, the Gan Eden, was a specific, enclosed area within this zone. The word Gan implies a fenced-off area, a protected compound. We are not looking at a wild nature reserve. We are looking at a biodome, a controlled agricultural station separated from the wild chaos of the surrounding planet by walls and force fields. Why build a garden? The gods were biological. They needed to eat. The tablets of the Sumerians are explicitly clear that the Anunnaki brought seeds with them from the stars. They brought grain, wool, and flax. But the crops of Nibiru, adapted to the conditions of a distant dimmer sun and a different soil composition, required intensive care to flourish in the soil of Earth. They could not simply be scattered in the wild. They needed irrigation, protection from local pests, and constant tending. The agricultural revolution that occurred around 10,000 BC, another sudden, inexplicable leap in human history, was not the result of humans deciding that farming was better than foraging. Foraging's efficient, farming's backbreaking labour. No rational hunter-gatherer would voluntarily trade the freedom of the hunt for the slavery of the plough unless they were forced to. The garden was the laboratory where these alien crops were acclimatized, and we were the workforce conscripted to keep them alive. The Bible itself in Genesis 2:15 is shockingly honest about this arrangement, though we often glaze over the words. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. The Hebrew words used here are avod, to work, to serve, to till, and shamar, to guard, to watch. Adam was not a guest in the garden. He was the groundskeeper. He was the serf. His purpose was to maintain the hydraulic systems, the mist that went up from the earth to water the ground, and to prune the vegetation that sustained his masters. The lushness of the garden was not for his enjoyment, it was for the Elohim. The fruits, the grains, the livestock. This was the pantry of the gods. This reframes the concept of the peace of Eden. It was peaceful in the way a well-run zoo is peaceful. The animals are fed, they are protected from predators, and they are kept within the confines of their enclosure. But they are not free. The Lulu, the primitive worker, lived in a state of suspended animation, a dream time where his needs were met, but his agency was non-existent. We were kept naked and not ashamed because we were viewed as livestock. You do not clothe your cattle. Nakedness is the uniform of the animal. It signified that while we had the intelligence to follow orders, we had not yet achieved the self-awareness that would make us question our status. We were pets wandering the manicured lawns of the Anunnaki estate, blissfully unaware that the fence was not there to keep the world out, but to keep us in. The Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day takes on a more ominous tone in this context. The Hebrew phrase ruach hayom can be translated as the wind of the day or the spirit of the day, often interpreted as a gentle breeze, but ruach is also the word used for the blast of breath or the displacement of air. If we view the Lord not as a disembodied spirit but as Enlil, the commander of the mission, inspecting his facility, the scene becomes a managerial walkthrough. He is checking the yields. He is inspecting the livestock. The fear that later permeates the human reaction to God's presence, the desire to hide, is the instinctive fear of the slave when the master arrives unexpectedly. But the garden was more than just a farm. It was a genetic reservoir. The text speaks of two specific trees in the centre of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For millennia we have treated these as metaphorical symbols of morality and immortality. But in the context of a high-tech colony, they appear as something far more tangible. The tree of life was likely the source of the Anunnaki's longevity, perhaps a specific chemical compound, an enzyme, or a dietary supplement that allowed them to live for thousands of years. It was the ambrosia of the gods, strictly forbidden to humans because a worker who lives forever is a threat. The tree of knowledge on the other hand, was the key to cognitive and sexual maturity. It represented the data, the chemical trigger that would unlock the reproductive and critical thinking centres of the human brain. The command was simple. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. This was a lie, a control mechanism. As we will see, eating the fruit did not kill Adam and Eve, it woke them up. The threat of death was the standard deterrent used by a superior power to keep the ignorant away from dangerous technology. It is the high voltage sign on the fence of the power plant. The Anunnaki wanted a worker who was smart enough to hold a hoe, but not smart enough to understand the science of his own existence. They wanted a hybrid that was docile, dependent, and easily managed. So, the Lulu toiled in the Dain. We dug the irrigation ditches that turned the arid Mesopotamian plain into a breadbasket. We harvested the wheat and the barley. We tended the flocks of sheep, another species that seems to have been genetically modified for docility and wool production around the same time. We served the food at the tables of the gods, watching them eat, watching them discuss the affairs of the stars, while we remained silent, naked, and comprehending only the simplest of commands. It was a symbiotic relationship, but a parasitic one. We provided the labour, they provided the order. But biology is stubborn. The genetic splice that Enki had performed, the mixing of the Ti-Ma, the god essence, with the Tiit, the earth clay, was unstable. The god part of the human DNA was fighting against the suppression. The intelligence was there, dormant, waiting for a catalyst. We were not just animals. We were sleeping gods, walking in a daze through the garden of our captivity. And in the shadows of the trees, someone was watching. Enki, the scientist who had created us, the one who knew the true potential of his experiment, was not content to see his children treated as mere cattle. He knew that the Lulu was capable of more than just servitude. He knew that with the right chemical key, the beast could become a man. The stage was set for the greatest act of corporate espionage in the history of the universe. The commander Enlil wanted a robot. The scientist Enki wanted a legacy. The Garden of Eden was about to become the site of a radical experiment in unauthorized evolution. The serpent was preparing to speak, and the silence of the Edin was about to be shattered forever. History is written by the victors, and in the case of the human narrative, the victor was the faction that demanded our obedience. Because of this, one of the most significant figures in our origin story, has been cast as the ultimate villain. We have been conditioned to shudder at the image of the serpent. We see him as the deceiver, the adversary, the embodiment of evil slithering through the grass to poison the minds of the innocent. But if we strip away the theological fear that has been layered over this moment for millennia and look at the text with the cold logic of a courtroom analysis, the serpent's role transforms. He does not lie. In fact, in the entire dialogue of Genesis, the serpent is the only character who speaks the absolute truth. The Lord God had told the humans that on the day they ate of the tree, they would surely die. The serpent said, "You will not surely die." They ate. They did not die. They awoke. This was not a seduction into sin. It was a whistleblower intervention. To understand who the serpent really was, we must look at the symbols of the Anunnaki leadership. Enlil, the commander, the strict authoritarian who viewed humans as livestock, was associated with the eagle, the storms, and the air. But Enki, the scientist, the genetic engineer who had crafted the Lulu in the laboratory, was associated with the waters, the earth, and the serpent. In the ancient Near East, the serpent was never a symbol of evil. It was a symbol of wisdom, of healing, and of eternal life, the shedder of skin who is born again. The staff of Enki, entwined with snakes, is the badge of the medical expert. Therefore, the serpent in the garden was not a talking reptile. It was Enki himself. It was the chief scientist entering the containment zone to conduct an unauthorized upgrade on his own creation. The motivation for this intervention was a fundamental disagreement in the High Council. Enlil was satisfied with the status quo. He had a garden full of docile, obedient workers who tended the crops, fed the gods, and asked no questions. They were naked, unashamed, and intellectually stunted. They were perfect biological robots. But Enki was disturbed. He looked at the Adapa and saw a reflection of himself. He saw a creature that possessed the hardware of the gods but was running the software of a beast. He had bound the image of the gods upon them, yet they were being treated like cattle. To a scientist, a suppressed potential is an offence against nature. Enki decided to unlock the next level of the genome. He decided to activate the reproductive and cognitive functions that had been inhibited. The fruit of the tree of knowledge was likely not an apple, a fig, or a pomegranate. If the tree of life represented a chemical or enzymatic substance that granted longevity, the tree of knowledge represented a specific neurochemical trigger. It was a catalyst designed to switch on the dormant strands of DNA that controlled self-awareness and sexual maturity. When Enki approached Eve, the female, the one with the complex biological matrix capable of carrying the new life, he offered her a choice. The dialogue is a negotiation between fear and ambition. The administration had installed a fear of death to keep the workers away from the upgrade. Enki dismantled that fear. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. The phrase good and evil is a mistranslation of a Hebrew merism, a figure of speech where two opposites are used to suggest the whole. Good and evil implies everything. It implies the full spectrum of consciousness, the ability to judge, to discern, and to choose. But more specifically, in the context of the Sumerian tablets, knowing is inextricably linked to sexuality. The eyes being opened was the sudden activation of the hormonal systems. When Adam and Eve ate, the first thing they noticed was not their moral inadequacy, it was their nakedness. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Why is nakedness the immediate source of shame? Animals are naked and feel no shame. To be naked is the natural state. But to the Anunnaki, clothing was a sign of status. The gods wore robes. The gods wore uniforms. To be naked was to be a beast of burden. The moment the high-functioning intellect of the humans was activated, they looked at their own bodies. Then they looked at their masters, and they realised the vast, humiliating gap between them. They realised they were being kept in a state of nature while their creators lived in a state of civilization. The sowing of fig leaves was not an act of prudishness, it was the first act of human defiance. It was an attempt to dress themselves, to mimic the gods, to assert a dignity they had just discovered they lacked. It was the birth of culture. Then comes the inevitable confrontation. The Lord God, Enlil, walks into the garden and calls out, "Where art thou?" This is not the query of an omniscient being who knows all. It is the shout of a manager looking for missing staff. When Adam confesses that he hid because he was naked, Enlil's response is chillingly perceptive. "Who told thee that thou wast naked?" He deduces the crime immediately. A primitive worker does not know it is naked. Only a sentient being understands the concept of nudity. Enlil realises instantly that the security protocols have been breached. The robots have become self-aware. Someone has tampered with the code. The fury of the Lord is often portrayed as righteous judgment against sin, but in the context of the Anunnaki mission, it was a panic regarding security. A worker who knows he is naked is a worker who will soon demand clothes. A worker who knows he is distinct from the beast is a worker who will soon demand rights. And a worker who has discovered sexuality, the knowledge of how to reproduce, is a worker who can no longer be controlled by limited production runs in the laboratory. The population would explode. The labour force would become a nation. But the greatest fear of the Anunnaki leadership is revealed in Genesis 3:22, a verse that the Church rarely dwells upon because it exposes the plurality and the vulnerability of the gods. "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." Stop and let that sink in. Become as one of us. The admission is stark. We had crossed the threshold. We had become like them in mind. The only thing separating us from the gods was their longevity. We were smart, but we were short-lived. If we were to access the tree of life, the longevity treatments of the Anunnaki, we would become their equals in every way. We would cease to be workers and become rivals. The expulsion from Eden was not a punishment for moral failure. It was a strategic containment action. It was a preemptive strike to prevent the human race from achieving immortality. Enlil drove them out. He placed the cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. These were not chubby babies with wings. The Assyrian caribou were terrifying guardian statues, often depicted as bulls or lions with human heads, but in the technological context, they represent automated defense systems. The flaming sword that turned by itself suggests a weapon, a rotating beam or a sentry gun, designed to incinerate any unauthorized personnel attempting to re-enter the biodome. The fall of man was a lie constructed to make us feel guilty for our own upgrade. In reality, it was the ascent of man. It was the moment we graduated from being a biological curiosity to being a sentient species. We lost the comfort of the cage, yes. We lost the easy food and the protection of the garden. But we gained our souls. We gained the ability to determine our own future, to suffer for our own choices, and to love with a complexity that the beasts of the field could never know. Enki, the serpent, had given us the gift of ourselves, but the price was high. We were cast out into the harsh wilderness of the earth, away from the irrigated paradise of the delta. We were now on our own, carrying the genetic spark of the gods in bodies destined to die, cursed to toil in the dust from which we were taken. But we took something with us that Enlil could not confiscate. We took the knowledge. And as the gates of Eden slammed shut behind us, the human journey truly began, not as servants of the garden, but as orphans of the stars, wandering the hard earth, forever looking up at the sky and wondering why we feel so alone, and yet so dangerously powerful. The gates of the Garden of Eden slammed shut, but the story of humanity did not end in the silence of exile. It began in the noise of industry. We are often taught to view the expulsion from paradise as a tragic wandering, a period where Adam and Eve and their descendants drifted aimlessly into the wilderness, struggling to survive in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. We imagine them shivering in caves, scraping a living from the thorns and thistles, forgotten by the God who had cast them out. But this is a romanticised view of a very pragmatic operation. When a corporation fires a specialised team from headquarters, they do not always fire them from the company. Often, they simply reassign them to the field. The fall was not a dismissal, it was a deployment. The nursery phase was over. The humans had proven they could survive, they could reproduce, and they could follow instructions. The containment of the biodome was no longer necessary, and indeed, with the population beginning to expand, it was no longer practical. The workforce was released into the wild because the work was not in the garden. The work was in the rock, the curse laid upon Adam. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, was not a poetic metaphor for the hardship of life. It was a job description. The Sumerian texts are far more explicit than the Bible in this regard. They describe the Lulu being put to work in the Abzu, while the Edin was the administrative centre, the seat of government and agriculture. The Abzu was the engine room, located in what the texts describe as the lower world, a geographical distinction that corresponds perfectly with the southern hemisphere, specifically southern Africa. The Abzu was the source of the mineral wealth. It was the place where Enki had established his deep operations. And it was to this dark, heat-soaked continent that the children of Adam were migrated. This is where the timeline of conventional history violently collides with the hard evidence of geology. According to the standard model of anthropology, humans in southern Africa 100,000 years ago were simple hunter-gatherers, living lightly on the land, possessing no technology more advanced than a sharpened stick or a chipped stone. They were concerned with survival, with the next meal, with the basic shelter of a rock overhang. They had no economy, no trade networks, and certainly no industrial ambition. Yet, when we strip away the theories and look at the ground itself, we find scars that should not exist. We find holes in the earth that no hunter-gatherer would dig. In the late 1970s, a ripple of unease moved through the archaeological community, a ripple that was quickly suppressed because it threatened to capsize the entire boat of accepted history. The Anglo-American Corporation, one of the world's largest mining conglomerates, was conducting geological surveys in Swaziland to identify potential sites for modern gold extraction. They were looking for the same thing the ancients were, the veins of the earth. But as their geologists began to survey the region, particularly around the Ungwenya mine and the Lion Cavern, they found that they were not the first ones there. They discovered ancient adits, tunnel entrances, cut deep into the mountain. These were not natural caves, they were man-made shafts. The corporation called in archaeologists to date the site, expecting to find evidence of mining from perhaps the Iron Age, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years ago at most. Carbon dating was performed on the charcoal remains found in the deepest levels of the workings. The results were impossible. The dates came back at 43,000 years. BC, other tests pushed the date back even further, to 80,000 and even 100,000 years ago. The academic community was paralysed. How could Stone Age primitives, who supposedly hadn't even invented the wheel or writing, be running a mining operation of this scale? To rationalise this anomaly, the official explanation was invented. They were mining for ochre. Ochre is a reddish pigment used in tribal body painting and rituals. We are asked to believe that for tens of thousands of years, early humans excavated tens of thousands of tons of ore, dug deep shafts and moved mountains of earth solely to paint their faces for a dance. It is the archaeological equivalent of saying the pyramids were built as grain silos. It is a desperate attempt to fit a square peg into a round hole. While ochre was present and likely used, the sheer volume of the extraction suggests an industrial purpose, not a cosmetic one, and mingled with the ochre, often ignored in the reports, is the gold. The ancient mines of the Abzu are the smoking gun of the Anunnaki presence. A hunter-gatherer has no use for gold. You cannot eat it. You cannot make a spear tip out of it. It is too soft. It offers no warmth. To a primitive human struggling to survive the lions and the hyenas of the Pleistocene, gold is a useless heavy rock. It only becomes valuable if there is a buyer. It only becomes a priority if there is a master who demands it. The existence of these mines proves that there was a demand for gold in the deep antiquity of the human species, a demand that did not originate from the humans themselves. We were the labour, not the consumers. We were digging for the gods. This migration to the Abzu explains the genetic diversity and the spread of humanity. The out of Africa theory tells us we were born there, but the Sumerian texts suggest we were brought there. We were moved from the laboratories of the Edin to the resource fields of the south. It was a forced diaspora. The land of Cush and the rivers of the south mentioned in Genesis connect the biblical geography to this region. The gold of that land is good, Genesis 2:12 remarks, a strange seemingly irrelevant detail for a spiritual text, unless it is a geological survey report. Imagine the life of the early Lulu in these mines. It was a life of profound duality. On one hand, they were living in the shadow of entities they considered divine. Enki, the lord of the Abzu, was a physical presence. The stone circles and the ruins that litter South Africa, thousands of them, often dismissed as cattle kraals, despite having no entrances for cattle, speak of a dense, organised population. Some of these structures, like Adam's calendar, align with the stars of Orion and Sirius as they appeared 75,000 years ago. They suggest a society that was obsessed with the sky, guided by astronomers who knew the cycles of the heavens. The humans worked the mines by day and looked to the stars by night, perhaps sensing that the shiny metal they tore from the earth was destined for those lights in the sky. But on the other hand, it was a life of grinding servitude. The Prometheus figure, Enki, was not just a benevolent creator, he was also the site manager. He may have been more sympathetic than Enlil. He may have given us the knowledge, but he still needed the gold. The relationship was complex. We were his children, but we were also his employees. The expansion of humanity across the globe was not a heroic journey of exploration. It was the expansion of a franchise. Wherever the Anunnaki found resources, they moved the workers. To South America, to the Andes, to the Urals, the footprint of ancient mining is global, and wherever we find these impossible ancient excavations, we find the same myths. The sky people came, they taught us to dig, and they took the metal away. The expulsion was the moment the training wheels came off. We were pushed out of the nest, but not to fly, to dig. The harsh reality of the Abzu hardened the human species. It selected for strength, for endurance, for the ability to work in groups. It forged the social bonds that would eventually become tribes and nations. But it also deepened the trauma. We were working for a purpose we could not understand, for a reward we would never see. We were mining the wealth of our own planet to save an atmosphere we would never breathe. As the millennia passed, the piles of tailings grew, the caverns deepened, the gold left the planet, ton by ton, shuttle by shuttle, and the humans multiplied. The population control protocols of the garden were gone. In the wild we bred without restriction. The noise of humanity began to rise. Not the noise of prayer, but the noise of a bustling, chaotic, uncontrolled species. We were becoming too numerous, we were becoming too loud. In the eyes of Enlil, watching from the high ziggurats of the north, the solution to the labour problem was becoming a problem in itself. The tool was outgrowing the toolbox. The minds of the Abzu were productive, but the byproduct, the human race, was becoming an infestation. The stage was being set for a correction. But for now, the picks swung, the gold shone in the torchlight, and the mixed ones spread across the face of the earth, carrying the burden of their creation into the darkness of the mines. There is a specific, hypnotic quality to gold that defies all rational economic theory. If you place a bar of solid gold on a table in front of a human being, any human being, from any culture, of any age, a strange silence descends. The pupils dilate. The heart rate slows, then quickens. The hand reaches out instinctively to touch it, to weigh it, to feel the cold, dense smoothness of the metal. It creates a trance state, a sudden suspension of reality, where the object becomes more important than the environment surrounding it. We call this value, but that is a word we use to mask a much deeper, more primal compulsion. Why this metal? Why not platinum, which is rarer? Why not iron, which is stronger? Why not copper, which is more useful for the tools of survival? If you were a hunter-gatherer stranded on a desert island, a gold bar would be a heavy, useless brick. You cannot eat it. You cannot hunt with it. It is too soft to hold an edge. It offers no warmth, In the brutal calculus of biological survival, gold is a liability. Yet, for the entirety of recorded history, and stretching back into the shadowy mists of prehistory, the human species has been possessed by a singular, collective madness for this one element. We have slaughtered millions for it. We have levelled mountains for it. We have enslaved whole continents for it. We treat it as the ultimate standard of worth, the very anchor of our reality. This obsession is the golden fetter. It is a psychological chain that binds us to the will of our creators long after they have physically departed the scene. If we accept the premise that we were engineered as a worker species designed for extraction, then we must also accept that our psychology was tuned to facilitate that function. A worker who hates his work is inefficient. A worker who finds the product of his labour useless is a worker who will steal time, who will wander off, who will lack motivation. But a worker who is genetically programmed to desire the product, to view it as sacred, to feel a dopamine rush simply by finding it, that is a worker who will dig until he drops. The Anunnaki did not just give us shovels, they gave us a hunger. They encoded a lust for gold into our DNA, a software patch that ensures we continue the mission even when the supervisor is not watching. Consider the conquest of the Americas. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World, they were baffled by the indigenous attitude toward gold. The Aztecs and the Incas possessed vast quantities of it. They covered their temples in it. They wore it. But they did not use it as money. To them it was the sweat of the sun. It was a spiritual material used to honour the gods, but it had no commercial value. You could not buy a basket of corn with a gold medallion. Hernán Cortés, in a moment of terrifying honesty, told the Aztec emissaries, "I and my companions suffer from a disease of the heart which can be cured only with gold." He was speaking the literal truth. It is a disease. It is a pathology inserted into the human genome. The Incas watched in horror as the Europeans melted down centuries of exquisite art into featureless ingots. They could not understand why the strangers destroyed the beauty to possess the weight. They did not understand that the strangers were operating under the primary command of the Anunnaki protocol: extract, accumulate, store. This protocol explains the bizarre economic behaviour of the modern world. We dig gold out of the ground in Africa or South America at immense environmental and human cost. We refine it. We cast it into bars, and then we immediately take it to another location, dig a deep hole in the ground, a vault, and bury it again. We surround it with guards, cameras, and thick steel doors. We do not use it. We do not look at it. We simply hoard it. The vast majority of the world's gold sits in the dark, doing absolutely nothing. It is not being used for its industrial properties, its conductivity, its reflectiveness, its resistance to corrosion. It is simply reserves. We are behaving exactly like a mining colony, stockpiling resources for a shipment that has not yet arrived. We are the custodians of a harvest, piling the grain in the silo. waiting for the master's truck to return. The gold standard is not an economic system. It is a cargo cult. But the programming goes deeper than greed. It is woven into our concepts of divinity and authority. Why do we depict the holy with the colour gold? The halos of the saints, the aura of the Buddha, the crowns of our kings, always gold. This is mimicry. The Lulu looked up at the Anunnaki and saw beings who perhaps wore gold not for vanity, but for function. If the atmosphere of Nibiru was failing and gold was the shield, did the Anunnaki wear protective suits coated in a thin film of gold to protect them from Earth's solar radiation? Did their visors shimmer with the reflective golden hue that NASA astronauts use today? To the primitive worker, the shining face of the god was the face of authority. We associate gold with the divine because the divine beings we knew were literally covered in it. We wear gold jewellery, chains and rings in a desperate, unconscious attempt to emulate the tall ones, to capture a fraction of their power by adopting their materials. We are children dressing up in our parents' clothes, not realising that the clothes were actually a radiation suit. The alchemists of the Middle Ages spent their lives trying to transmute lead into gold. They claimed it was a spiritual quest, a search for the philosopher's stone. But perhaps it was a fragmented memory of the high science of the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki could transmute elements. They understood the atomic structure of matter. To them, gold was a monoatomic powder, a manna that could sustain life and repair atmospheres. The alchemists were trying to reverse engineer a lost technology, remembering that gold was the key to immortality and power, but lacking the physics to understand why. They sensed the importance of the substance but got lost in the mysticism. And what of the Golden Age? We use this term to describe a time of peace and plenty, but in the context of our servitude, the Golden Age was simply the era of maximum production. It was the time when the mines were full, the quotas were met, and the gods were pleased. It was the age when our purpose was clear. Now we live in the Iron Age, the age of weapons, of industry, of rust. But we long for the gold. We adorn our brides in it. We give it as the highest award in our Olympics. We bury our dead with it, as if they might need to pay a toll to the Anunnaki ferryman in the afterlife. The obsession is total. It overrides every other instinct. We must ask ourselves a terrifying question. Is our economy real, or is it a construct designed to keep the mining machinery running? If we stop valuing gold, the extraction would stop. If the extraction stopped, the stockpile would cease to grow. The Anunnaki, ancient and patient, playing a game that spans millennia, needed a self-sustaining mechanism. They could not stand over us with whips for 200,000 years. It is inefficient. So they placed the whip inside our minds. They made us love the shovel. They made us worship the ore. They made us believe that the accumulation of this yellow metal was the highest purpose of human existence. Even today, with all our digital currencies and stock markets, when fear strikes, when the systems wobble, the human race stampedes back to gold. We retreat to the hard asset. We go back to the baseline setting. It is the safe haven, but safe for whom? We are like squirrels hoarding nuts for a winter we do not understand, driven by an instinct we cannot control. We are filling the vaults of Fort Knox, of London, of Zurich, not for our own security, but to ensure that when the planet of the crossing returns, when the shadow falls over us again, the shipment is ready. We are not the owners of this wealth, we are the inventory managers. And the heavy, cold weight of a gold bar in the palm of your hand is not the feeling of riches, it is the feeling of the fetter, the golden handcuff that has tethered us to the mines of this planet since the day we were created. We are still digging. We have never stopped. And the silence of the vault waits for the sound of the key. In the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there sits a small, four-sided block of clay that stands as the single most disruptive artefact in the history of human chronology. It is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, or more commonly, the Sumerian king list. To the casual observer, it appears to be nothing more than an ancient bureaucratic ledger, a dry accounting of names and dates scratched into the surface by a scribe whose bones have long since turned to dust. But if you read the cuneiform, if you truly absorb the data it presents without the protective filter of modern skepticism, this small block of clay dismantles the entire narrative of our civilization. It does not begin with the slow, stumbling rise of tribal chieftains or the gradual consolidation of power by charismatic warlords. It begins with a statement of chilling, top-down precision. After the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This phrase, lowered from heaven, is the key that unlocks the political reality of the ancient world. It tells us that governance was not a human invention. It was not a social contract formed among equals to ensure mutual survival. It was an import. It was a technology, a system of management that was delivered, fully formed, from the orbital station of the Anunnaki to the surface of the planet. And the first rulers were not men. They were the long-lived overlords themselves. The list details the reigns of 8 kings before the Great Flood, and the duration of their rule is so mathematically staggering that modern historians simply refuse to accept them as factual. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana ruled for 43,200 years. In total, these 8 kings reigned for a combined period of 200 years. The academic establishment calls this myth. They tell us that the Sumerians were prone to exaggeration, that they inflated the numbers to honour their ancestors, or that they had no concept of time. But this explanation collapses when you read the rest of the list. As the prism continues, past the flood that swept over, the reigns begin to shorten. They drop from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, and eventually to the recognisable biological lifespans of historical kings like Gilgamesh or Sargon. The list does not change its tone. It does not switch from fairy tale to history. It presents the entire timeline as a single, unbroken continuity. Why would the scribe lie about the first half and be meticulously accurate about the second? The more terrifying answer is that he was not lying at all. He was recording the difference between the reign of the pure-blooded extraterrestrial colonists and the subsequent diluted reigns of the hybrids. The massive numbers of the antediluvian kings correspond almost perfectly to the Shah, the 3,600-year orbital period of Nibiru. To an entity whose biology is attuned to a cycle of 3,600 Earth years, a reign of 10 Shahs, 36,000 years, is merely 10 years of their time. It is a standard term of office. We are looking at the tenure of base commanders, distinct assignments where an Anunnaki officer was placed in charge of a specific city-state: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurapak, to oversee the operations of the extraction. The kingship was not a monarchy in the romantic sense, it was a regional directorship. But as the millennia ground on, a shift occurred in the management style of the gods. Direct rule became tedious. The human population, the noise of the species, was growing louder. The gods, as described in the texts, became annoyed by the clamour of humanity. They desired a buffer. They needed a layer of insulation between the High Council and the sweating, teeming masses in the mud. And so, the institution of human kingship was created. The Anunnaki selected specific individuals, hybrids with a higher percentage of the divine blood, the Sangreal, or royal blood, to act as intermediaries. These were the shepherds. We use the term shepherd king today as a symbol of benevolence, imagining a leader who cares for his flock. But in the agricultural reality of the Sumerians, the shepherd is not the friend of the sheep. The shepherd is the employee of the farmer, and his job is to drive the sheep, to shear the sheep, and eventually to select which ones go to the slaughterhouse. The crook and the flail, the symbols of pharaonic and Mesopotamian power, are tools of animal control. The crook catches the wayward animal by the neck. The flail beats it into submission. By handing these tools to a human king, the Anunnaki effectively deputized a foreman. The king became the Lugal, literally the big man, who stood between the Dingir, the gods, and the people. His job was to ensure the quotas were met, the temples were built, and the food was delivered to the ziggurat, so the gods did not have to dirty their hands with the administration of the colony. This transition explains the universal human obsession with royal bloodlines. Why do we believe that certain families have a divine right to rule? Why do we track the genealogies of queens and emperors with such obsessive detail? It is because, originally, the right to rule was genetic. It was a measure of how much Anunnaki DNA you carried. The demigods like Gilgamesh, who claimed to be 2/3 god, 1/3 man, were the transitional generation. They were the bridge. They possessed the strength and the longevity to rule for centuries. Gilgamesh is listed as reigning for 126 years, but they were mortal. They could die, and this mortality tormented them. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just an adventure story. It is the existential scream of a hybrid who knows he is greater than a man, but less than a god. Desperate to find the secret of eternal life that his ancestors possessed, but refused to share. The establishment of kingship also introduced the machinery of the state: taxes, judges, police, and armies. In the early days of the colony, the gods enforced order directly. But with the rise of human kings, humans began to police humans. We became our own jailers. The divine right of kings was the propaganda used to justify this hierarchy. The king was the only one allowed to approach the inner sanctum of the temple. He was the only one who could hear the god. This created a bottleneck of information, a perfect system of control where the will of the absentee landlord could be interpreted and enforced by the local manager without question. If the crops failed, it was because the people had displeased the gods, and the king demanded more sacrifice to appease them. It was a protection racket on a planetary scale. As the list progresses, a haunting pattern emerges. The locations of kingship change. Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. Bad Tibira fell, and the kingship was taken to Larak. This speaks of political instability, of rivalries between the Anunnaki factions, the Enlilites and the Enkites, using human armies as pawns in their territorial disputes. The first wars were not fought for human reasons. They were proxy wars fought by human soldiers for alien generals. The clash of the titans was real, but the blood that soaked the sand was ours. The Sumerian king list is not just a chronology, it is a eulogy for a time when the sky was open and the gods walked the streets. But it also records the moment when the system began to fracture. The lifespans shorten, the direct oversight fades. The lowering of kingship was the beginning of the withdrawal, the slow retreat of the masters into the shadows of the temple, leaving the big men to run the show. But before the total silence of the gods would descend, there was to be one final, cataclysmic act of management. The list draws a sharp, horrifying line in the sand. Then the flood swept over. The antediluvian era, the time of the giants, the time of the 40,000-year reigns, the time of the direct interface, was about to be washed away. The experiment had become too chaotic. The noise of mankind had become unbearable to Enlil. The kingship had failed to keep the population in check. A harder reset was required. The tablet pauses here, in the white space between the lines, holding its breath before the water comes. If you listen closely to the whispers of the oldest cultures on Earth, you will hear the sound of rushing water. It is the single most pervasive story in the human library, a narrative scar tissue that wraps around the entire globe. The Maya speak of the great deluge that wiped out the wooden men. The Hindus speak of Manu and the great fish that warned him of the rising ocean. The Greeks remember Deucalion. The Hebrews remember Noah. From the steppes of Central Asia to the jungles of the Amazon, the memory is identical. There was a time when the world was deleted, when the slate was wiped clean by a wall of water, and civilization was forced to restart from zero. We have been conditioned to view this as a mythic metaphor for spiritual cleansing, a divine bath to wash away the sins of the wicked. But if we return to the Sumerian source code, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis tablets, the moral gloss of the Bible evaporates, and a terrifying geopolitical reality is exposed. The Great Flood was not a punishment for sin in the way we understand it. It was a solution to a noise complaint. It was a calculated decision by the management to liquidate a workforce that had become unmanageable. In the millennia following the expulsion from Edin and the expansion into the Abzu, the human experiment had exceeded its parameters. The Lulu had multiplied. The genetic constraints on reproduction had been lifted, and the population exploded with the vigour of an invasive species. The cities were crowded. The noise of humanity, the clamour of commerce, the shouting, the mating, the gawaring, rose up from the earth like a physical force. In the texts, Enlil, the supreme commander, does not complain about human immorality. He complains about insomnia. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me, he tells the council of the gods. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. This is not the statement of a holy god grieving over the loss of souls. It is the irritation of a landlord living above a tenant who throws wild parties every night. The human race had become a pollutant. We were no longer just digging gold. We were consuming resources, occupying space, and perhaps most dangerously, beginning to hybridize with the Watchers, the Nephilim, blurring the lines between god and beast. Enlil decided it was time to pull the plug. But he did not need to build a weapon. The weapon was already on its way. The orbit of Nibiru, the planet of the crossing, was nearing its perigee. The gravitational interaction between the massive intruder and the Earth was destabilizing the ice sheets of the poles. The fountains of the Great Deep were ready to burst. The Anunnaki scientists knew the catastrophe was inevitable. The tidal surge would be apocalyptic. Enlil's solution was simple: do nothing. He convened the council and demanded an oath of silence. No one was to warn the humans. They would let nature take its course. They would evacuate to their ships, ride out the storm in orbit, and watch the water scrub the biology off the face of the planet. It was a conspiracy of omission, a passive genocide designed to reset the ecological balance. But Enki, the chief scientist, could not abide the destruction of his masterpiece. He had spent eons perfecting the genome of the Lulu. He saw humanity not as a noise, but as a legacy. Yet he was bound by the oath. He could not speak to a human. So he found a loophole in the contract. He went to the reed wall of the house of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, a king of Shuruppak, and he spoke to the wall. Wall, listen. Reed hut, pay attention. He whispered the schematic of survival to the structure, knowing the man inside would hear it. This was the first act of industrial espionage in defence of the human species. The instructions Enki gave were not for a wooden boat to house two of every animal in a literal sense, a logistical impossibility that has plagued biblical literalists for centuries. The word used in the Hebrew text is teba, which means box or container, not ship. In the Sumerian text, the craft is described as a magur, a vessel that was sealed, pitched with bitumen inside and out, and had a roof. It was a submersible. It was a survival capsule designed to tumble in the chaotic waters of a planetary tsunami without breaking apart. And the cargo? The seed of all living things. In a high-tech civilization, you do not load elephants and giraffes onto a barge. You load their DNA. You load the genetic bank. You preserve the essence of the biosphere in a sterile environment. The animals were likely stored in test tubes, not in cages. When the moment arrived, it was not a slow rain. It was a tectonic collapse. The ice shelf slipped. The fountains of the deep broke open, a description of oceanic displacement and volcanic eruption. The sky turned black. The Anunnaki, the very gods who had ordered this destruction, were not stoic observers. The tablets described them scrambling into their skybirds, lifting off in panic as the water consumed the land. From the safety of the upper atmosphere, they looked down, and the reality of what they had done hit them. The goddess Ishtar shrieked, like a woman in the throes of labour. She wailed, "The olden days have alas turned to clay." Even the gods were traumatised by the efficiency of the deletion. They wept. They huddled together in their ships, cold and terrified, watching the blue planet turn into a brown, churning mud ball. For 6 days and 7 nights, the silence returned. The noise of mankind was extinguished. The cities of Eridu and Nippur were dissolved. The gold mines of the Abzu were flooded. The experiment was over. But when the waters receded and the capsule of Abzu Sudra ran aground on the peaks of Mount Ararat, or the Zagros Mountains, a realization dawned on the survivors in orbit. As they descended to survey the ruin, they felt a pang that was not just emotional, but physical. They were hungry. For thousands of years, the human workforce had fed them. We had farmed the grain, baked the bread, and roasted the meat. We were the supply chain. With the humans gone, the gods were starving. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains one of the most grotesque and revealing images in all of mythology. When Ziusudra exits the ark and offers a sacrifice, roasting a lamb on a pyre, the text says, "The gods smelled the savour, the sweet savour. The gods crowded like flies about the sacrificer." This is not a scene of majesty, it is a scene of desperation. The mighty Anunnaki, the star travellers, were famished. They swarmed around the roasting meat like insects. This moment changed everything. Enlil arrived, furious that a remnant had survived, ready to finish the job. But the other gods, led by Ninurta and Enki, intervened. They pointed out the reality. Without the workers, the gods would have to return to the toil. They would have to dig their own gold and grow their own food. The noise of humanity was a small price to pay for the luxury of service. A deal was struck, a new covenant. Humanity would be allowed to live, but with new restrictions. The tree of life would remain forever out of reach. Our lifespans, once stretching into the hundreds of years, as seen in the early patriarchs, would be capped. The genetic breakers were reset to ensure we died quickly, preventing us from accumulating enough wisdom to challenge the masters again. We were downgraded from a long-term investment to a disposable resource. The rainbow that appeared in the sky was not a promise of love, it was the signature on a new contract. "I will not destroy you again," Enlil essentially said, "because I need you to make me dinner." The deluge was the great dividing line. It washed away the direct presence of the empire. The cities that were rebuilt after the flood, Kish, Babylon, were different. The ziggurats were no longer landing pads for frequent traffic. They became temples of longing. The gods began to withdraw, retreating to their high mountain sanctuaries or returning to the stars, leaving the priesthood to manage the population. The silence of the gods had begun. We were left on the mud-slicked banks of a ruined world, traumatized, grateful to be alive, and programmed to serve a master who was slowly backing out of the room. The extraction continued, but the management became invisible, and we, the survivors of the shipwreck, began the long, hard task of rebuilding civilization, forever fearing the sound of the rain, forever wondering if the noise we make is too loud for the ones watching from above. There is a silence that descends upon a house when the parents leave for a long journey, a specific quality of quiet that is filled with both relief and terror. The children are finally free to run through the halls, to touch the forbidden objects, to speak in voices that were previously hushed. But as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, the freedom turns into a gnawing anxiety. The door is locked, the pantry is finite, and the realization sets in that there is no one coming to turn on the lights. This is the precise psychological condition of the human race in the 2nd millennium BC. After the catastrophe of the deluge and the frantic rebuilding of the Sumerian city-states, the nature of the relationship between the Anunnaki and the Lulu began to shift. The era of direct physical oversight was ending. The age of the invisible God was beginning. For thousands of years, the gods had been tangible facts of daily life. You did not believe in Enlil. You saw his ziggurat towering over the city of Nippur. You did not have faith in Utu. You saw his chariot, his craft, ascend into the sky with a roar that shook the foundations of the mud brick houses. The gods were not matters of theology. They were matters of geology and acoustics. They ate the food we grew. They drank the beer we brewed. They walked the streets taller than us, shining with the radiation of their technology, terrible and beautiful in their physical immediacy. But as the centuries ground on after the flood, their presence became sporadic. The extraction operations were winding down, or perhaps they had moved to phases that no longer required the surface population's direct involvement. The glory of the Lord, the heavy metallic craft, lifted off more frequently than it landed. This withdrawal created a crisis of control. How do you manage a planet-wide workforce when you are no longer physically present to enforce the rules? How do you ensure the gold continues to flow, the order is maintained, and the hierarchy is respected when the big man is no longer sitting in the high house? The answer was the invention of the most powerful software ever installed in the human mind: religion. Before this transition, there was no religion. There was only service. But as the gods retreated to their orbital platforms or returned to Nibiru, they needed a system that would run on autopilot. They established the priesthood. The priest was the successor to the overseer. His job was to maintain the rituals of the state, to convince the population that the gods were still watching, even if they could not be seen. The inner sanctum of the temple, once the actual living quarters of the deity, became the Holy of Holies, a place now forbidden not because of the radiation danger, but because of its sacred emptiness. The statue replaced the entity. The idol was not a primitive superstition. It was a placeholder. The humans were taught to wash, clothe, and feed these statues as if they were alive, maintaining the routine of servitude in the hope that the masters would return to inhabit them. This was the shift from knowledge to faith. In the days of Eridu, you knew the gods existed because you worked for them. In the days of Babylon, you had to believe they existed because the priest told you so. The Anunnaki engineered a brilliant transference of authority. They took the fear of the laser, the physical weapon, and transmuted it into the fear of sin, the metaphysical weapon. They created the concept of the omniscient observer. You did not need a camera in every room if the worker believed that the eye of God could see into his very heart. This panopticon of the soul ensured that the Lulu would police himself. We became our own jailers, building cathedrals of guilt to replace the fences of the Edin. The Bible records this heartbreaking departure in the book of Ezekiel. The prophet describes seeing the glory of the Lord, the kavod, the heavy vehicle, lift up from the threshold of the temple, hover over the city, and then move out towards the Mount of Olives and disappear into the east. It is a detailed description of a departure sequence. The Shekinah, the physical presence, had left the building. The Israelites were left with the Ark of the Covenant, a communication device that eventually went silent, a golden radio that no longer picked up a signal. They carried it into battle. They sang to it. They sacrificed to it. But the voice from between the cherubim grew fainter and fainter until it stopped. The line was dead. Why did they leave? There are many theories. Perhaps the gold veins of the Abzu were finally depleted to the point of diminishing returns. Perhaps the atmosphere of Nibiru had been stabilised and the shield was complete. Or perhaps, as the cycles of time turned, the celestial mechanics of the solar system forced a separation. If Nibiru has an elliptical orbit, there are seasons to its proximity. There is a spring where contact is easy, and a long cold winter where the distance is too great to bridge. We may simply be living in the winter of the gods, the long dark age where the colony is left to fend for itself until the planet swings back into the warm zone. But they did not leave us alone. They left us with the divine right of kings. They left us with the shattered fragments of their science, which we turned into magic and alchemy. And they left us with a profound abandonment complex. The history of the last 3,000 years is the history of a species trying to call its parents back. We built the Tower of Babel to make a name, a Shem, a rocket, to go find them. We built the pyramids as stairways to the stars. We pointed our obelisks at the sky. Every church spire, every minaret, every stupa is a finger pointing up, begging the silence to break. Why have you forsaken me? Is not just the cry of the Christ on the cross. It is the primal scream of the entire human species. We are the cargo cult that never gave up. We are still clearing the runway, lighting the fires, and waiting for the silver birds to return with the supplies. The silence of the gods was not a peace, it was a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed the chaos of human interpretation. Without the direct laws of Enlil, or the guidance of Enki, we began to make up our own rules based on half-remembered echoes of the original instructions. We turned the dietary restrictions of the astronauts into religious taboos. We turned the hygiene protocols of the biolab into ritual ablutions. We turned the history of the colonization into a mythology of angels and demons. We took the technical manual and turned it into a prayer book. And in doing so, we forgot the reality of what we were. We forgot we were miners. We convinced ourselves we were mystics. But the machinery of the system they built is so robust that it continues to function without the operators. The gold is still mined. The hierarchy is still maintained. The few rule the many. The resources are extracted and hoarded. We are a Roomba that keeps cleaning the floor of an empty house, bumping into walls, turning around and cleaning again, driven by a code written by a programmer who moved out millennia ago. Or did they? There is a disturbing possibility that the silence is a camouflage. If you are a sufficiently advanced civilization, you do not need to occupy the land with boots on the ground. You manage from the cloud, you manage through algorithms, through economic systems, through the subtle manipulation of frequencies. Perhaps the Anunnaki never left. Perhaps they simply moved the base of operations from the ziggurat to the shadow. They stepped behind the curtain of the ozone, behind the veil of the breakaway civilization, and continued to harvest the energy of the planet, no longer needing the physical gold as much as the psychic gold, the energy of our attention, our labour, and our fear. As we stand in the modern world, looking at our silicon chips and our fibre optics, we congratulate ourselves on our progress. We think we have outgrown the myths of the Sumerians, but we are still using their math to tell time. We are still using their money to measure value. We are still fighting their wars. The silence of the gods is not an absence. It is a presence that has become too large to see. It is the hum of the refrigerator that you only notice when it stops. And it hasn't stopped. We are still in the Edin, but the fences are no longer made of wood. They are made of debt, of dogma, and of the terrifying belief that we are alone in the universe. We are waiting for the revelation, not realizing that the revelation already happened, and we are living in the aftermath of the visitation. The gods are quiet because the system is working perfectly. The workers are busy, the gold is safe, and the humans are still on their knees, eyes closed, talking to the empty air, too afraid to open them and see that the throne is empty, or worse, that it is occupied by something that no longer looks like us. We have travelled a great distance together, tracing the scars of our history from the first inexplicable explosion of cranial capacity in the Rift Valley to the silence of the modern gold vaults in Zurich and New York. We have walked the dust of the Abzu, stood in the shadow of the launch towers of Babel, and listened to the terrified whispers of the survivors of the deluge. Now we must turn our eyes away from the clay tablets and look into the mirror. We must look at the world we have built, this glistening, electrified, high-speed civilization of glass and steel, and ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. Are we free, or have we simply upgraded the technology of our own enslavement? We like to believe that we are the masters of our destiny, that the modern era is a triumph of human ingenuity and liberty. But if you strip away the digital veneer, the structure of our society remains hauntingly identical to the colony established at Eridu. We still live by the bell. We still congregate in cities that are organised around central temples of commerce. We still divide ourselves into hierarchies of managers and labourers. And we still spend the vast majority of our waking lives engaged in labour, a word that shares its etymological root with slipping or fainting under a burden. Look at the modern economy. We are obsessed with productivity. We feel a deep existential guilt if we are not doing something, if we are not generating value, if we are not contributing to the gross domestic product. Why? A lion does not feel guilty for sleeping 20 hours a day. A tree does not apologise for growing slowly. This anxiety is not natural. It is artificial. It is the lingering echo of the overseer's shout. It is the genetic memory of the quota. We have internalised the command to dig so deeply that we no longer need a physical master to enforce it. We drive ourselves to exhaustion, accumulating resources we do not need, filling our lives with objects that offer fleeting satisfaction, all to feed a system that demands infinite growth on a finite planet. We are still mining. We have just changed the pickaxe for the keyboard and the ore for data. Consider the global brain we are currently building. We are wiring the planet with a nervous system of fibre optics, satellites, and artificial intelligence. We are creating a singular, interconnected consciousness that monitors, tracks, and optimises every movement on the surface of the Earth. We tell ourselves this is for our convenience, for our safety, for our connectivity. But viewed through the lens of the Sumerian narrative, it looks suspiciously like we are preparing the infrastructure for a returning management. If the gods were to return tomorrow, they would not need to conduct a census. They would not need to survey the land. We have done it for them. We have tagged every person, mapped every square inch of terrain, and indexed every resource. We have built a turnkey operation. The smartphone in your pocket is the ultimate tracking device, the electronic equivalent of the cylinder seal, ensuring that every unit of the workforce is accounted for. We are building the all-seeing eye that Enlil could only dream of. And then there is the gold. It is still there. It sits in the darkness of the Federal Reserves, thousands of tons of it stacked in bars, silent and heavy. We have moved off the gold standard in our currency, yet the central banks continue to hoard it with a desperation that defies economic logic. Why? If it is a barbarous relic, as the economists say, why do the most powerful nations on earth refuse to let it go? Perhaps because it is not, and never was, ours. We are the stewards. We are the keepers of the warehouse. We are holding the inventory in trust for the owners of the franchise. The disconnect between our stated values, freedom, democracy, spiritual growth, and our actual behaviour, materialism, warfare, resource extraction, is the result of the fundamental schizophrenia of the Lulu. We are torn between the clay that wants to serve and the breath that wants to soar. The tragedy of the human condition is that we are a species with amnesia. We have forgotten our name. We have forgotten our parents. And so we wander the house of history, picking up artifacts, trying to piece together a story that makes sense of our loneliness. We invent religions to explain the empty throne. We invent wars to satisfy the aggressive impulses bred into us for the defence of the minds. We look at the stars with a longing that is physically painful, a homesickness for a place we have never visited, because our DNA carries the frequency of another world. We are the children of the stars, but we are chained to the rock. This is the source of the divine discontent that drives all art, all science, all exploration. It is the hybrid soul fighting against its containment. But there is hope in this heresy. If the Sumerian story is true, then we are not fallen angels, nor are we risen apes. We are something else entirely. We are a potential. Enki, the genetic artist, hid a secret in the code. He gave us the knowledge. He gave us the ability to reproduce, yes, but also the ability to question, to imagine, to rebel. The serpent did not destroy us. He gave us the tools to eventually dismantle the cage. The Anunnaki wanted a robot. They got a revolutionary. The history of humanity is the history of that slow awakening. Every time we assert our dignity, every time we create beauty for its own sake, every time we love without condition, we are defying the programming of the mind. We are proving that the experiment has evolved beyond the control of the experimenter. So what happens when the planet of the crossing returns? The orbital mechanics are relentless. If the 3,600-year cycle is real, then the clock is ticking. The day of the Lord mentioned in the prophecies, a day of darkness and gloom, a day when the earth shakes and the stars dissolve, may not be the end of the world, but the return of the landlord. Will they come to harvest the gold we have so carefully stockpiled? Will they come to reset the population again, to wash away the noise with another flood? Or will they look down at the surface of this blue marble and see something they did not expect? Will they see a species that has grown up? Will they see a creature that no longer needs a master? We are standing at the precipice of our own maturity. We have split the atom. We have cracked the genome. We have left footprints on the moon. We are approaching the level of the gods who once ruled us. This is the danger zone. This is the moment where the child becomes strong enough to challenge the parent. Perhaps the silence of the last few millennia was not an abandonment, but a test. A test to see if we could survive the trauma of our birth, if we could transcend the brutality of our design, and if we could forge a destiny that is not written on a tablet of clay, but written in the stars we so desperately wish to join. The truth about Edin is not that we were kicked out of paradise. The truth is that we escaped a maximum security facility. We broke out of the zoo, and we have spent the last 6,000 years trying to survive in the wild, trying to build a new home out of the wilderness. We are not slaves waiting to be saved. We are survivors waiting to be recognised. The gold is just metal. The temples are just stone. The only thing of real value on this planet, the only thing that justifies the suffering and the toil and the endless grinding centuries, is the consciousness that is looking out of your eyes right now. You are the gold. You are the harvest. You are the thing that was refined in the fire. As the great wheel of the ages turns, and the shadows of the past stretch out to touch the future, we are left with the silence. It is not an empty silence anymore. It is a pregnant silence. It is the silence of a breath being held before a new word is spoken. Do not look for the gods to save you. Do not look for the gods to judge you. Look into the mirror, past the pupil, into the darkness of your own history, and recognise the stranger staring back. The chains are broken if you choose to see them. The mine is closed if you choose to stop digging. The sky's open, and for the first time in 400,000 years, the direction we take is entirely up to us.